The roar does not stop all at once. It decays. It begins as a unified, thunderous wave of sound, a physical pressure against your eardrums. Then it fractures into individual voices, shouts, cheers, groans. Then it becomes a muffled rumble as you enter the tunnel, the concrete swallowing the chaos. Then, finally, it becomes a memory, replaced by a new, more intimate soundscape. The clatter of cleats on concrete, the grunts of exhausted men, the slap of shoulder pads against locker room stalls. And underneath it all, for some men, a persistent, high-pitched ring. A tinnitus that is not just a medical condition, but the auditory ghost of the hit you just took, the permanent echo of the collision. This is the true exit from the arena. Not the glory of the highlight reel, but the slow, painful decompression from warrior back to mere mortal. For most, this process resets by Tuesday. The body recovers. The mind forgets the fear. But for a distinct group of men, a specific class of athletes who played a specific position in a specific season, that decompression never ended. The ringing never stopped. The pain never receded. They walked into that season as franchise quarterbacks, and they walked out of it as broken men, their careers and often their health shattered on the altar of a game that was changing faster than the rules could protect them. History remembers the 1985 season for the Chicago Bears and their legendary defense. But there is another legacy, a quieter, more painful one. This is the story of the lost class of '86. The quarterbacks who, due to the systematic, brutal violence levied against them in 1985, never took another meaningful snap. Their careers didn't just end. They were annihilated. Consider the physics of a pocket collapse in that era. It was not a simple failure of protection. It was a coordinated implosion. The offensive linemen, bound by rules that limited how they could use their hands, were often mere obstacles to be navigated. The pass rushers, unleashed by defensive schemes that prized blindside terror and schematic confusion, were missiles with moving targets painted on the quarterback's spine. The pocket was not a sanctuary. It was a killing box. And in 1985, the killers were more sophisticated, more athletic, and more merciless than ever before. We mythologize players like Lawrence Taylor, and rightfully so, for his transcendent talent. But we rarely sit with the cumulative toll of that terror on the men tasked with facing him. It wasn't just the one hit he delivered. It was the 10 hits you absorbed anticipating where he might be. The mental calculus became a physical tax. Your internal clock, that precious sense of when to throw, was constantly being recalibrated by panic. And panic leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to punishment. The anecdotes from that season read like a medical textbook authored by a sadist. There is, of course, the canonical horror of Joe Theismann on Monday Night Football. The compound fracture of his right leg, the bone protruding through the skin, live on national television. That image is seared into the memory of every fan who saw it. But in focusing on the shocking visibility of Theismann's injury, we risk missing its true significance. It was not an anomaly. It was the exclamation point on a season-long sentence of violence. Theismann was 36, a veteran, a former MVP. His body had absorbed over a decade of punishment. The hit that broke his leg was simply the final, catastrophic failure of a structure that had been stressed to its limit. The fact that it was Lawrence Taylor, the avatar of this new defensive age, who delivered the hit, made it a perfect, terrible symbol. But Theismann was just the most public casualty. Less than a month earlier, in a game far from the national spotlight, the St. Louis Cardinals' Neil Lomax, a young quarterback with a cannon arm and budding star potential, was sacked 7 times by the Philadelphia Eagles. The final sack drove him into the veteran stadium turf like a tent peg. He left the game with what was called a bruised back. In reality, it was a spinal injury, a traumatic insult to his central nervous system that would be the first major deposit in a long account of physical ruin. Lomax would play a few more years, but he was never the same. The pain became chronic, managed only by staggering amounts of anti-inflammatory medication. That single hit in Philadelphia didn't end his career that day, but it began the process of ending him. Then there is the story of Ken O'Brien of the New York Jets. In a November game against the Miami Dolphins, O'Brien was sacked a staggering 6 times and hit on at least 20 other occasions. The Jets' offensive line was a turnstile that day. O'Brien, known for his toughness, kept getting up, but each rise was slower than the last. By the fourth quarter, he was operating in a fog of pain and concussion. He finished the game, a meaningless act of bravery in a blowout loss. Film from that game shows a man slowly being dismantled. The pinpoint accuracy that was his trademark vanished, replaced by desperate, off-balance heaves. His mechanics, honed over a lifetime, broke down into survival instincts. After that game, O'Brien confessed to a reporter that he couldn't remember the whole series of plays. He played the rest of the season and for several more years, but the quarterback who emerged from that 1985 beating was a different, diminished player. His confidence in the pocket was forever fractured. The punishment had reprogrammed him. We can list the names like a roll call of the wounded. Steve Bertkowski in Atlanta, his knee destroyed, his mobility gone, playing out his final years as a stationary target. David Woodley in Pittsburgh, battered into retirement, his talent eroded by constant pressure. Mark Wilson in Los Angeles, a gifted passer who saw ghosts for the rest of his career after surviving the '85 Bears. These men were not linked by team or conference. They were linked by fate, by the position they played in a year when the balance of power violently, decisively shifted to the defense. They were the canaries in the coal mine, and in 1985 the mine was full of poison gas. The silence that followed for these men was not just the quiet of an empty stadium. It was the silence of a phone that stopped ringing with football offers. It was the silence of a doctor's office as you were given a diagnosis with the word degenerative in it. It was the silence of your own living room, trying to explain to your young children why daddy couldn't get down on the floor and play. It was the silence of lying awake at 3 in the morning, listening to that eternal ring in your ears, your body a map of throbbing pain, wondering what it was all for. The applause had faded completely. What remained was the cost. The lost class of '86 never had a reunion. They never issued a statement. Their exit was as quiet as their suffering was loud. They simply vanished from the stage, leaving behind statistics that hinted at unfulfilled promise and game film that served as forensic evidence of their destruction. This is not a story about poor play or a lack of heart. It is a story about a system. The 1985 season represented the apex of a certain football philosophy, one where the quarterback's body was an acceptable cost of doing business. The rules, the coaching, the culture, and the league's marketing all converged to create an environment where inflicting maximum physical punishment on the passer was not just legal, but celebrated. The quarterbacks of that era were caught in a trap. The game was getting faster, the defenders bigger and stronger, but the protections for them were antiquated, designed for a different, slower sport. They were analog players in a game that had just gone digital, and the code was written in pain. This is the chilling, curiosity-driven heart of our story. How did the league allow this to happen? What was the true human cost of that iconic, celebrated season of defense? And what does the fate of these forgotten men tell us about the price of progress, and the voices we choose not to hear when the crowd is roaring? Their silence is the most important part of this story. It is the silence we must now break. To understand the carnage of 1985, you must first understand the ecosystem that bred it. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It was a harvest, the yield of seeds planted years earlier in the fertile soil of competition, innovation, and a burgeoning television economy. The National Football League of the mid-1980s was a corporation hitting its stratospheric boom period. Monday Night Football was a cultural institution. The Super Bowl was becoming an unofficial national holiday. With eyes and dollars flooding in, the product on the field underwent a ruthless, Darwinian pressure to become more exciting, more dramatic, and more visceral. And nothing is more visceral than violence. The league found itself in a paradoxical arms race. The rules, largely designed to protect defensive players and promote scoring, had inadvertently created the conditions for a defensive revolution. And in this revolution, the quarterback was not just an opponent. He was the ultimate strategic prize, the king on the chessboard, and the entire game became about hunting him down. The historical context is critical. The 1970s had ended with rules changes famously known as the Mel Blount Rule. which limited contact by defensive backs beyond 5 yards, and other modifications meant to free up the passing game. The intent was noble: more offense, more points, more excitement. But like any system, it prompted an adaptive and devastating response. If you couldn't maul receivers downfield, you had to get to the quarterback faster. The early 1980s saw the rise of the 3-4 defense as a potent counter-strategy. Instead of 4 down linemen, you had 3, creating more ambiguous gaps, and you added a 4th linebacker, often a freakish athlete like Lawrence Taylor, who could rush, cover, or stunt from a hidden alignment. This created confusion. For an offensive line, assignment blocking became a nightmare. You couldn't identify the primary threat because the defense disguised it until the moment of the snap. The quarterback, standing behind this suddenly uncertain wall, held the ball a fraction of a second longer, trying to decipher the coverage. A fraction of a second is the difference between a completion and a catastrophic hit. Simultaneously, the physical prototype of a pass rusher evolved. He was no longer just a large, strong man at defensive end. He was an edge predator. He was taller, faster, and longer than his predecessors. Coaches like the New York Giants' Bill Parcells and the Chicago Bears' Buddy Ryan didn't just want these players to tackle the quarterback. They wanted them to destroy the quarterback. The philosophy was psychological as much as physical. A kill shot wasn't just about forcing a fumble. It was about planting a seed of terror that would bloom later in the game, or the next time you faced that team. The sack became the ultimate defensive currency, and the highlight shows, produced by the league's own film arm, NFL Films, packaged these hits with thunderous sound effects and heroic narration. They were selling the mythology of the gladiator, but they were also, quite literally, providing a coaching tape for how to inflict maximum damage. The message to defensive players was clear. The most celebrated thing you can do is demolish the quarterback. And then there were the rules, or more accurately, the space between the rules. The in-the-grasp provision was theoretically designed to protect quarterbacks from unnecessary punishment when a play was clearly over. In practice, it was a phantom. Officials were reluctant to blow a play dead while the quarterback was still upright, even if he was enmeshed in the arms of a lineman. This gave a second and third defender a free run to launch themselves at a stationary or nearly stationary target. Hits to the head were illegal, but the definition was narrow. A clothesline or a direct forearm shiver was a penalty. But the helmet-to-helmet collision that occurred as a natural consequence of a high-speed rush, that was often deemed incidental, a byproduct of competitive play. The roughing the passer penalty existed, but it was reserved for egregious, late hits, often after the whistle. The vast, gray area of punishment during the play was considered fair game. The quarterback, in the eyes of the officiating culture of the time, was understood to assume a certain risk. He was the pilot. Crashes were an occupational hazard. This documentary will argue that the 1985 season was the point where all these vectors, strategic innovation, athletic evolution, permissive officiating, and cultural glorification, converged with perfect, devastating symmetry. It was a laboratory experiment in quarterback trauma. We will move beyond the well-trodden narrative of the '85 Bears. Instead, we will use that team's dominance as a backdrop, the most extreme example of a league-wide phenomenon. Our focus will be on the men in the crosshairs. We will follow their season, not through wins and losses, but through the cumulative toll of hits absorbed. We will examine the medical understanding or profound lack thereof that governed their treatment. We will delve into the pharmaceutical culture that kept them on the field, masking catastrophic damage until it became permanent. We will explore the economic machinery of the league that made them disposable assets, their health a depreciating line item on a balance sheet. This story is built on testimony. We will hear from the quarterbacks themselves, those who can and will speak. We will hear from their teammates, who watched the disintegration from the closest possible vantage point. We will hear from the defenders, men like Lawrence Taylor and Richard Dent, who were celebrated for their brutality but now, years later, reflect on it with a more complicated perspective. We will consult orthopedic surgeons and neurologists who can explain in clinical detail what exactly those hits did to human knees, spines, and brains, and how the medicine of the 1980s was hopelessly unequipped to handle it. We will hear from journalists who covered the league, who saw the violence escalate but whose warnings were often drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the league's powerful public relations engine. The scope of this investigation is both specific and vast. We will focus narrowly on the 1985 season and its immediate aftermath, tracing the careers of a cohort of quarterbacks who entered that year as starters and were, within a few seasons, gone from the game. But within that focus, we will expose systemic truths about professional football that remain relevant today. This is a story about what happens when an industry's economic incentives run directly counter to the biological well-being of its employees. It is a story about how a culture of toughness can become a catalyst for irreversible damage. It is a story about how progress in sports is often purchased with the broken bodies of those who came before. We will not shy away from the complexity. These quarterbacks were not naive children. They were highly compensated, competitive adults who willingly stepped onto the field. Many would say they'd do it all again. That contradiction is central to the narrative. The allure of the game, the identity it provides, the glory it promises, is powerful enough to make men willingly risk their future selves. That does not absolve the system. It deepens the tragedy. It speaks to the power of the institution and the completeness of the buy-in it demanded. Our journey will be chronological, moving from the build-up to the 1985 season, through its weekly grind of punishment, into the long, silent aftermath that continues to this day. We will see how the destruction of this class of quarterbacks became the catalyst for the next major wave of rule changes, the ones that truly began to protect the passer in the early 1990s. The men of the lost class of '86 were, in a terrible sense, sacrifices on the altar of progress. Their broken bodies were the data points that proved the game had become too violent to sustain its own star power. This documentary is an attempt to reclaim their names from the footnotes of history, to listen to the silence they have carried for 4 decades, and to understand the true price of a game that America fell in love with, a love affair that was built, in part, on a generation of men who were left behind. This is not a eulogy for a bygone era of toughness. It is a forensic audit. An unblinking examination of a season that functioned as a factory, taking in healthy young athletes and producing, as its output, a group of men permanently separated from their physical potential. We are about to walk through that factory room by room, process by process. We will see the blueprints, the machinery, the raw materials, and the finished, damaged goods. The story of the 1985 NFL season is the story of how the game learned the limits of the human body, by testing those limits to the point of breaking. This is the story of the sack not as a statistic but as an ending. Before a single quarterback was sacked in anger in the 1985 season, the groundwork for their destruction had been meticulously laid. The violence was not incidental. It was engineered. To understand what happened to the men in the pocket, you must first understand the evolution of the men hunting them. The early 1980s witnessed a fundamental reimagining of defensive football, a shift from reactive containment to proactive predatory assault. This was a revolution in technique, in physical preparation, and most importantly, in mentality. The pass rusher was no longer a supporting actor in the defensive scheme. He was the protagonist. His mission was not merely to tackle the quarterback, but to dismantle the offense's entire psychological framework by dismantling the man who ran it. This transformation created a new breed of athlete, one whose sole purpose was to inflict a specific kind of calculated terror. The 1985 season was their coming-out party, and the quarterbacks were the unwilling guests of honor. The change began with the body. The prototypical defensive end of the 1970s was a strong, often heavy man, tasked with setting the edge against the run and pushing the pocket on passing downs. He was powerful, but he was not necessarily a refined speed threat. The new model, pioneered by players like Fred Dean of the San Francisco 49ers and then perfected and weaponized by Lawrence Taylor of the New York Giants, was a hybrid. He was a linebacker by designation and end by function. He stood up on the edge, giving offensive tackles no pre-snap key to his intentions. Would he drop into coverage? Would he blitz? The uncertainty alone stole precious milliseconds from the quarterback's mental clock. But the physical evolution was even more critical. These players were among the first generation to benefit from dedicated year-round strength and conditioning programs that were becoming standard in the NFL. They weren't just strong. They were explosively strong. They trained for first-step quickness, for the ability to convert raw power into forward velocity in an instant. They studied leverage not just as a physical principle but as a weapon. A tackle's outside shoulder became a target. His inside knee became a vulnerability. The goal was not to engage in a stalemate. It was to defeat the blocker with such sudden, violent force that the path to the quarterback was cleared in one decisive move. Lawrence Taylor was the archetype, but he was not an anomaly. He was the proof of concept. His athleticism was otherworldly, but his impact was magnified by the system built around him. Bill Parcells and defensive coordinator Bill Belichick in New York designed a scheme that turned Taylor loose. They used him as a movable, unpredictable weapon, lining him up on either side, standing him up, putting his hand in the dirt, sending him on inside stunts. The offensive line's assignment became a weekly nightmare of complex slides and communication. One missed call, one moment of confusion, and Taylor was through, a force of nature with a quarterback in his sights. His signature move, the hump move, was a perfect metaphor for this new era. He would engage the tackle, deliver a powerful blow with his inside forearm to the tackle's chest, knocking him off balance and humping him backward, creating instant separation. It was not finesse. It was overpowering violence designed to create immediate access. Taylor's success didn't just make the Giants better. It sent a directive to every defensive coordinator in the league. Find your own version of this. The arms race was on, and find them they did. The 1985 Chicago Bears defense, coordinated by Buddy Ryan, was the apotheosis of this philosophy, not with one singular predator, but with a swarm of them. Richard Dent, Dan Hampton, Steve McMichael, Mike Singletary, they were a collective engine of destruction. Ryan's 46 defense was less a scheme and more a declaration of war. It overwhelmed offenses with sheer numbers at the point of attack, creating one-on-one matchups that his superior athletes were expected to win, and win decisively. The philosophy was rooted in intimidation. Ryan famously instructed his players to hit the quarterback on every play, legal or not, to wear him down, to make him hear footsteps. The goal was to break the quarterback's will, to make him surrender mentally before the final physical blow was delivered. This was psychological warfare waged with physical tools. The Bears players, from the legendary Hampton to the relentless Dent, were perfect vessels for this ideology. They were not just playing a game, they were executing a mission, and the mission statement was pain. But the evolution wasn't just about superstars. Trickled down. Pass rushing specialists became coveted assets. Teams sought smaller, faster linebackers who could do one thing supremely well: turn the corner and flatten the quarterback. The sack statistic, officially adopted by the NFL in 1982, became a premier individual metric, a way to quantify and monetize this destructive skill. Players were incentivized, both financially and in terms of fame, to hunt the quarterback above all else. This had a subtle but profound effect on the game's technique. The classic form tackle, wrapping up, driving through the ball carrier, was often abandoned for the kill shot. The highlight reel play was the blindside launch, the full-force blast that separated the quarterback from the ball and from his senses. Defenders were taught to see the ball, hit the ball. But in practice, that often meant seeing the quarterback's numbers and launching their helmet directly through them. The strip sack became an art form, but the act of stripping the ball often involved a violent, whirling axe chop at the quarterback's throwing arm, a move that risked breaking bones as much as dislodging the football. This shift was mirrored in the way the game was taught and glorified. NFL Films, the league's in-house propaganda arm, played an unintentional but crucial role. Their slow-motion footage, set to grandiose classical music or thumping rock anthems, turned brutal collisions into ballets. The narration, delivered by the godlike voice of John Facenda, mythologized the violence. A sack wasn't a tackle. It was a quarterback carnage. A hit wasn't painful. It was jacked up. These productions were masterpieces of storytelling, but their story was one where pain was noble and destruction was beautiful. They were watched religiously by fans but also by players, including young, impressionable defensive players learning what the league truly valued. The message was clear. To be celebrated, to be immortalized in highlight reels, you must inflict memorable punishment. This cultural feedback loop accelerated the arms race. Defenders wanted to make those highlight tapes. Coaches designed schemes to create those highlight opportunities. And quarterbacks stood in the middle, the essential foil in this drama. They're suffering the necessary ingredient for someone else's glory. The final, critical piece was the rulebook's lag. The NFL's competition committee had spent the late 70s and early 80s crafting rules to protect receivers and encourage passing. But they had not adequately anticipated the defensive counter-revolution. The rules governing contact with the quarterback were vague and poorly enforced. The in-the-grasp rule was a phantom, as we've established. Rules against hitting a quarterback below the knees or in the head were inconsistently applied and often required malicious intent to be called. In the heat of a pass rush, with a 270-pound athlete moving at full speed, the line between a legal hit and an illegal one was microscopically thin, and officials erred on the side of letting the play continue. This created an environment of permissiveness. Defensive players learned the boundaries not by the rulebook, but by the flags that were, or more often, were not thrown. They pushed those boundaries every Sunday, discovering in real time how much violence the officials would tolerate. By 1985, they had pushed them very, very far. The pocket had become a lawless frontier, and the sheriff was seldom in town. So, as the 1985 season dawned, the stage was set. On one side, an army of predators, physically perfected, strategically unleashed, culturally celebrated, and operating in a space with minimal consequences. On the other side, a group of quarterbacks largely protected by rules written for a different era, relying on offensive line techniques that were struggling to adapt. It was a mismatch of historic proportions. The hunters had been meticulously crafted, their tools sharpened, their instincts honed. The season would be a sustained demonstration of their lethal efficiency. The quarterbacks were not just playing against a defense. They were facing the end product of a half-decade of football evolution, an evolution that had placed their health and safety as the lowest priority. This was the making of the predators. What followed was the harvest. The National Football League's rulebook has never been a document of absolute truths. It is a living text, a constantly shifting compromise between offense and defense, safety and spectacle, order and chaos. In any given era, the game is defined not just by the rules written in ink, but by the vast, unregulated wilderness that exists between those lines. By 1985, defensive players and coaches had become master cartographers of that wilderness. They didn't just learn the rules, they learned the spaces the rules forgot. They studied the limitations of officiating, the biases of referees, the split-second judgments that could be influenced by aggression. What emerged was a cold, calculated understanding. The rulebook, designed to provide a framework for fair competition, could itself be weaponized. The very gaps intended to allow for the flow of the game became avenues for orchestrated violence. The quarterbacks of 1985 were not simply playing against 11 men. They were navigating a legal landscape that had been deliberately tilted toward their destruction. The most glaring and consequential loophole was the notorious in-the-grasp rule. The rule's intent was humane: to protect a quarterback who was clearly immobilized in a tackler's grasp from taking additional, unnecessary hits. In theory, it was a safeguard. In practice, it was a mirage. The interpretation of clearly immobilized was left entirely to the subjective, rapid judgment of the referee. In the frantic, collapsing chaos of a pocket, a quarterback wrapped by one defender was rarely deemed immobilized if he still had a foot planted or his arm was cocked. This created a catastrophic delay. For a pass rusher bearing down, that delay was an invitation. It told him he had a free shot, a window of opportunity to unload on a quarterback who was, for all functional purposes, already tackled. The second and third hits were not penalties. They were logical extensions of a play the whistle had allowed to continue. The message from the officials was implicit. The quarterback is fair game until he is physically on the ground and the play is unequivocally over. This turned every sack into a potential multi-hit event. A quarterback would be grabbed by a defensive end, struggle for balance, and then, from his blind side, a linebacker would arrive at full speed, launching his helmet into the quarterback's ribs. The first hit pinned the target. The second hit inflicted the real damage. This legal gray area was compounded by the rules surrounding contact with the head and neck. Striking a quarterback in the head with a forearm or a closed fist was illegal. But the helmet-to-helmet collision that occurred as a natural byproduct of a high-speed tackle? That was a different matter. The language was fuzzy, often requiring proof of forcible or intentional contact. In the eyes of officials, if a pass rusher was ostensibly trying to wrap tackle and his helmet happened to collide with the quarterback's, it was frequently deemed incidental contact, a part of football. Defensive players quickly learned this distinction. They could, with a slight adjustment of angle, ensure that the initial and most forceful point of contact was their own helmet, while still making a wrapping motion with their arms. It was a technique of plausible deniability. They were not striking, they were tackling. The result was a dramatic increase in concussive impacts, injuries that were rarely diagnosed because the mechanism was hidden in plain sight within a legal-looking tackle. The quarterback's head became a magnet for helmets, not out of cartoonish malice, but because the rules did not adequately disincentivize it. Furthermore, the rules governing hits on a quarterback who had just released the ball were perilously narrow. The roughing the passer penalty was reserved for hits that were late, flagrant, and often involved a second step or a clear launch after the ball was gone. A defender who left his feet a fraction of a second before the throw and made contact a fraction of a second after? That was considered a good, hard football play. The margin for error for the quarterback was 0. He had to release the ball and then somehow evade a human missile already in flight, a missile that had no physical ability to abort its mission. This placed an impossible cognitive and physical burden on the passer. He had to follow through on his throw, knowing that doing so would leave him completely exposed to a hit he could neither avoid nor mitigate. The rule didn't protect him during this vulnerable follow-through phase. It only protected him after the hit was obviously demonstrably late. This encouraged defenders to time their rush not to the ball's release, but to the quarterback's final step in his drop. Their target was not the passing lane, but the spot where the quarterback would be at the end of his motion. They were taught to punish the finish. Defensive coaches of the era, men like Buddy Ryan and Bill Parcells, didn't merely accept these gray areas. They built their philosophies around them. They coached to the very edge of the rulebook, and often a step beyond, calculating that the occasional penalty was a worthwhile trade for the constant, wearing threat of punishment. Ryan's famous instruction to his players: hit the quarterback every chance you get. Legal or illegal, hit him, was not a call for lawlessness. It was a strategic calculation. He understood that the occasional 15-yard penalty was a cheap price for making a quarterback jittery for the remaining 59 minutes of a game. It was a form of psychological investment. A late hit might draw a flag, but it also planted a seed of resentment and fear in the quarterback's mind. Would the next hit be late too? Would the officials protect him? This erosion of trust between the quarterback and the illusion of his own safety was a tactical victory. The rulebook's penalties were a slap on the wrist. The psychological damage was permanent. This manipulation of the rules extended to the very geometry of the pass rush. The chop block and the head slap were techniques that lived in a moral and legal twilight. While not all were technically legal, their enforcement was sporadic. The goal was to disrupt the offensive lineman's balance and technique by any means necessary, creating those precious half-second openings. A well-placed, powerful slap to the side of a tackle's helmet could disorient him just enough to allow a speed rusher to turn the corner. A low block could take out a lineman's legs. These were the dirty, foundational secrets of pressure. They were the unspoken tactics that made the highlight reel sack possible. The league turned a blind eye because these actions happened in the trench warfare, away from the quarterback, away from the glamour of the highlight. But their consequence was felt directly by the man standing behind that disrupted line. He was the ultimate recipient of every legal and extra-legal action taken against his protectors. The officials themselves were part of this ecosystem. They were former athletes, steeped in the same culture of toughness. Their instinct was to let them play, to avoid inserting themselves into the physical contest unless absolutely necessary. Throwing a flag for a borderline hit on a quarterback was often seen as soft, as interfering with the natural, violent order of the game. This created a profound home field advantage for defensive aggression. In loud, hostile environments where the crowd roared for blood, the marginal, late hit was even less likely to be called. The quarterback was not just facing 11 men. He was facing the collective will of a stadium and the reluctant whistle of officials who were culturally conditioned to tolerate a higher level of violence. The rulebook in his hands was a fragile shield. In the hands of his opponents and the men officiating the game, it was a map showing all the places he could be legally, and sometimes illegally, attacked. By the start of the 1985 season, this understanding was not subtext. It was the text. Every defensive player in the league knew exactly how far he could go. Every quarterback knew exactly how little protection he truly had. The game had entered a period of brutal equilibrium where the defenders held all the leverage. The rules, through their ambiguity and lax enforcement, had created a monster. The pocket was no longer a sanctuary defined by rules. It was a legal no man's land where power ruled. The quarterbacks stepping into that space in the autumn of 1985 were not simply executing a sport. They were entering a gladiatorial arena where the law was deliberately vague, and the punishment for their profession was written not in penalties, but in pain. The weaponization of the rulebook was complete. All that remained was for the season to document the casualties. Every era has its defining wound. A single catastrophic moment so visceral, so publicly displayed, that it momentarily cuts through the mythology and forces a raw, unvarnished look at the reality beneath the spectacle. For the NFL in 1985, that moment arrived on a cold Monday night in Landover, Maryland, during the second quarter of a game between the New York Giants and the Washington Redskins. It involved the league's most charismatic defensive predator and one of its most recognizable veteran quarterbacks. The play itself lasted 4 seconds. Its echo has lasted 4 decades. Joe Theismann's compound leg fracture, live on national television, was more than a gruesome injury. It was a rupture. It was the hidden violence of the season made horrifically visible. It was the logical, if extreme, endpoint of every predatory tactic, every rulebook loophole, every coached aggression of the era. That night, the stadium fell silent. The broadcast booth fell silent. And for a moment, the entire sport held its breath, staring at the consequence of its own creation. The context is essential. Theismann was 36, a former league MVP, a Super Bowl champion, the articulate and defiant leader of a proud franchise. He represented the old guard, a quarterback who had succeeded with mobility, guile, and toughness in a league that was rapidly becoming bigger, faster, and more violent. Lawrence Taylor, the Giants' transcendent outside linebacker, was his polar opposite, the embodiment of the new defensive revolution, a physical force so disruptive he required entire offensive schemes to be built around stopping him. Their confrontation was symbolic. It was the past meeting the future at full speed. The play itself was a simple, well-executed run. Theismann, after a play-action fake, turned to hand the ball to running back John Riggins. As he did, Giants linebacker Harry Carson crashed into the line, disrupting the exchange. As he did, Giants linebacker Harry Carson crashed into the line, disrupting the exchange. Theismann, entangled with his own fullback, began to fall backward. Lawrence Taylor, pursuing the play from the backside with his otherworldly speed, dove toward Theismann, his arms wrapping around the quarterback's waist in an attempt to tackle him. As Taylor's momentum carried him forward, the lower half of Theismann's right leg, pinned beneath his own weight and the force of Taylor's pull, snapped grotesquely, the tibia and fibula fracturing and breaking through the skin. The sound, picked up by the field microphones, was not the crisp crack of a gunshot, but a sickening, wet crunch. The image, replayed instantly from the reverse angle, was one of pure anatomical betrayal. A human leg, designed to bear weight and propel an athlete, bent at an impossible angle, a white shard of bone visible against the dark grass. The reaction on the field was one of immediate, instinctive horror. Lawrence Taylor, realizing what had happened, sprang to his feet and began frantically waving for the medical staff, his face a mask of shock and anguish. He did not celebrate. He did not taunt. He recoiled. That reaction, from the league's most fearsome defender, spoke volumes. Even he, the architect of so much intimidation, was unprepared for the concrete reality of this level of damage. Theismann, lying on the ground, famously said to his teammates, "Don't move me." He knew. In that instant, he knew his career was over. The broadcast team of Frank Gifford, Joe Namath, and O.J. Simpson, all former players themselves, lapsed into a profound, uncomfortable silence, broken only by Gifford's strained, "Oh my God, I think Joe Theismann's leg is broken." There were no words adequate to the sight. The production truck, perhaps unsure of the protocol for such a graphic injury, replayed the angle once, then wisely pulled back. The message was transmitted to 20 million living rooms. This is what can happen. But to isolate Theismann's injury as a freak accident is to misunderstand 1985 entirely. It was not an anomaly. It was the most visible data point in a season-long epidemic. The very same weekend, across the league, quarterbacks were being pummeled with a similar, if less photographically dramatic, ferocity. Neil Lomax was enduring his spinal trauma in Philadelphia. Ken O'Brien was absorbing his 20-plus hits in Miami. Theismann's injury was unique only in its visual clarity and its primetime audience. It served as a terrifying public service announcement for what every quarterback in the league was privately experiencing. The human body has limits, and the NFL's style of play was systematically finding them. Theismann's broken leg was just a more immediate, less deniable form of the same destruction being meted out to knees, shoulders, and brains every Sunday. It was the ultimate sack, the final, irrevocable taking down of a quarterback, not just for a play, but for a career. The league's official response was a masterclass in compartmentalization. Publicly, there were statements of concern and well wishes for Theismann, a revered figure. The incident was treated as a tragic, isolated event. There was no immediate announcement of a competition committee review. No sweeping new rules were proposed to protect quarterbacks in the grasp. The machine absorbed the shock and kept moving. The following Sunday, the games went on. The pass rushers continued their hunt. The officials continued their permissive oversight. The culture of jacked-up highlights continued unabated. Theismann's injury was somehow placed in a separate category, a horrible but distinct occurrence, rather than being understood as the direct and inevitable product of the environment the league had fostered. This was the true testament to the NFL's power, its ability to witness a catastrophe of its own making and narrate it as a random tragedy, divorcing effect from cause. Privately, however, a different conversation began. Among general managers, coaches, and even some players, a cold calculus took place. Theismann was a star. He was marketable. He was the face of a major franchise. His loss was not just a football loss. It was a business loss. The injury forced a reluctant acknowledgement of a dangerous truth. The league's defensive revolution was threatening to consume the very assets that drove its popularity. You could not build a television empire around interchangeable quarterbacks being carried off the field. The spectacle required stars, and stars needed a reasonable expectation of survival. Theismann's injury made the abstract risk concretely financial. It was no longer just about player safety in a moral sense. It was about asset protection in a corporate sense. This was the beginning of a slow, decades-long pivot, but in 1985, the business imperative was not yet strong enough to overcome the football culture of violence. The lesson was noted, but not yet acted upon. For the quarterbacks around the league, Theismann's injury was a chilling landmark. It was a reminder that the line between playing with pain and suffering a career ender was vanishingly thin. It made the abstract threat of every blindside hit suddenly terrifyingly concrete. Every quarterback who saw that replay internalized it. It became a part of their mental film library, a ghost that would appear in their peripheral vision during every subsequent pocket collapse. It added a new layer of fear, a subconscious flinch that could disrupt the pinpoint mechanics required to succeed. The injury did more than end Theismann's career. It psychologically wounded an entire generation of passers. They now had proof in high definition of what the stakes truly were. The pit in their stomach when the pocket collapsed now had a specific, gruesome image attached to it. November 18, 1985 was therefore a paradox. It was simultaneously the peak of the NFL's violent era and the beginning of its end. The injury itself was the ultimate expression of that violence, a moment so pure in its horror that it could not be glorified or sanitized. Yet, it also planted the seed for the eventual reform. It created a before and after in the public consciousness. It forced the league, however reluctantly, to begin a long, internal assessment of its own product. The night Joe Theismann's leg broke was the night the NFL's Darkside was exposed in the brightest possible spotlight. The game could no longer claim ignorance, could only choose, in the years to come, whether to heed the warning or continue to ignore the cost. In the immediate aftermath of that Monday night, however, the choice was clear. The season rolled on, the predators remained unleashed, and the lost class of quarterbacks continued their march toward their own, quieter endings. Theismann's was just the first and most famous name on a long list of casualties. For every catastrophic, headline-making injury like Joe Theismann's, there were a dozen others that operated as slow-motion disasters. These were not fractures captured in a single graphic frame, but rather a systematic unraveling, a series of traumatic withdrawals from a body's finite bank of resilience. The case of Neil Lomax, the standout quarterback for the St. Louis Cardinals, is the definitive study of this more insidious form of destruction. His career was not ended by one snap of bone, but by the relentless, accumulated toll of the 1985 season and the medical protocols that enabled him to keep playing through it. Lomax entered that year as a rising star, a Pro Bowl quarterback with one of the league's most powerful arms and a reputation for fearless play. He exited it, though it would take several more years to fully manifest, as a medical patient on a path to permanent disability. His story is not one of a single hit, but of a body being used as collateral against its own future, a debt that would eventually come due with staggering interest. Lomax's physical prowess was undeniable. At Portland State, he had put up video game numbers, and he carried that gunslinger mentality into the NFL. He was big, strong, and capable of making every throw. More importantly, he was tough. In the early 80s, he played behind often overmatched defensive lines, taking sacks and getting up, developing a reputation for durability. By 1984, he had led the Cardinals to a playoff berth and earned his first Pro Bowl selection. He was, by all measurements, arriving as a franchise quarterback. The 1985 season was to be his confirmation. But the Cardinals' schedule placed him directly in the path of the era's most vicious defensive fronts. The Philadelphia Eagles, his Week 10 opponent, were a particularly brutal crew, known for their gangrene defense and a penchant for intimidation. The game was played at Veterans Stadium, on its unforgiving artificial turf, a surface that provided no give, transforming every impact into a direct transfer of kinetic energy to joints and bone. The beating Lomax took that day was methodical. He was sacked 7 times. The final sack was the coup de grace. As he dropped back, pressure immediately collapsed the pocket. Driven backward, he was slammed to the turf by massive Eagles defensive end Reggie White, with another defender landing on top of the pile. The force drove the breath from his lungs and jolted his spinal column with whiplash violence. He left the field with what was diagnosed as a severe back bruise. The terminology was deliberately benign, but the reality was a significant spinal contusion, a traumatic injury to the intricate architecture of vertebrae, discs, and nerves. This was not a muscle pull. It was a central nervous system event. In today's medical understanding, it would have warranted immediate and extensive imaging and likely a multi-week shutdown. In 1985, it was an injury to be managed. Lomax, embodying the code, missed only a handful of plays. He returned to the game, his movement visibly restricted, his throwing motion altered by a torso that could no longer rotate freely without shooting pain. This is where the real damage was cemented. The initial injury was severe, but the decision to return him to play, and to keep him playing in the subsequent weeks, transformed an acute injury into a chronic, degenerative condition. Lomax's throwing motion was a masterpiece of torque and leverage, power generated from the ground up through his legs, his core, and into his right arm. The back injury severed that kinetic chain. To compensate, he began to overuse his arm, placing unnatural stress on his shoulder. The pain in his back was constant, a fiery ache that settled into a permanent dull roar. To practice, to play, to simply get through the day, he entered the pharmaceutical pipeline that was standard for the era. The regimen was a cocktail of anti-inflammatory injections like cortisone and powerful oral painkillers. The injections masked the inflammation, the painkillers masked the pain signals, but neither did anything to heal the damaged tissue. In fact, they enabled further damage. By silencing the body's alarm system, they allowed Lomax to subject his spine to repeated trauma it was in no condition to withstand. Every practice rep, every game hit, every fall onto that hard turf was another micro-trauma, another withdrawal from his body's account. The statistical record tells a stark story. Before the 1985 Eagles game, Lomax was a 64% passer with a quarterback rating hovering near 90. In the games immediately following the injury, his completion percentage plummeted, his interceptions rose, and his quarterback rating fell into the 70s. This was not a loss of skill or nerve. It was a loss of physical capacity. He could not plant his back foot with authority. He could not follow through across his body. He could not step into throws to the left sideline without a seizing pain in his lumbar spine. Defenses, seeing his limited mobility, dialed up even more pressure, knowing he was a stationary target. The cycle became vicious. Injury led to diminished play, which led to more sacks and hits, which compounded the injury. He played the entire 1986 season in this diminished state, and by 1987, the compensatory damage had migrated to his shoulder. Tendinitis and eventually a torn rotator cuff followed, directly attributable to the altered mechanics forced upon him by his broken back. By the time he was traded to the Seattle Seahawks in 1989, Lomax was a shell of his former self. The arm talent was still occasionally visible in flashes, but the physical instrument was fundamentally compromised. He retired after the 1989 season, at the age of 30, an age when many quarterbacks are entering their prime. The silence of retirement was not peaceful. It was filled with the constant, aching testimony of his body. The back pain never left. The shoulder pain persisted. And then, a new and more terrifying consequence emerged. The decades of high-dose anti-inflammatory drugs, the NSAIDs like indomethacin he took daily to function, had ravaged his kidneys. The very medicine that allowed him to play had poisoned him. In 1991, just 2 years after his retirement, Neil Lomax was diagnosed with end-stage renal disease. His kidneys were failing. The connection between long-term NSAID use and kidney failure is well established in medical literature. For Lomax, the cause and effect were tragically direct. The treatment for the injuries sustained in the pocket was now killing him. His life became defined by dialysis. 3 times a week, for 4 hours at a time, he was hooked to a machine that filtered the toxins from his blood, a process that is exhausting, debilitating, and a constant reminder of mortality. He spent a decade on the transplant list, his football fame providing no shortcut. In 2002, he received a kidney transplant, a reprieve that carried its own lifetime of immunosuppressant drugs and medical vigilance. The proud, powerful quarterback was now a permanent patient, his body a monument to the hidden costs of his profession. The hits from 1985 did not just end his career. They sentenced him to a life of medical dependency. The glory of his Pro Bowl season was permanently eclipsed by the reality of dialysis clinics and transplant rejection fears. Neil Lomax's story is the archetype of the slow-motion casualty. He was not carried off the field on a stretcher to a national gasp. He walked off again and again until he couldn't walk without pain. His injury was invisible to the fan, masked by toughness and medication, but it was more ultimately destructive than a clean break. It was a degenerative condition, a life-altering sentence passed down by the violence of a single season and the medical culture that served the game, not the player. He is proof that the destruction of the 1985 season was not always theatrical. Sometimes it was quiet, bureaucratic, and administered with a needle and a pill bottle. It was a debt that took years to fully present itself, a bill that came due long after the stadium lights had been turned off, and the price was not a lost season, but a transformed life. If the defensive schemes of 1985 were the blueprint for destruction, and the rulebook its legal framework, then the medical and training practices of the era were the essential machinery that kept the entire operation running. The human body, pushed beyond its natural limits by the violence of the sport, required systematic intervention to remain on the field. This was not a story of healing, but of suppression. The medical philosophy that dominated NFL locker rooms in the mid-1980s was not oriented toward long-term health or holistic recovery. The sole objective was availability. Could the player play on Sunday? Every diagnosis, every treatment, every pharmaceutical decision was filtered through this singular, relentless question. For the quarterbacks of the lost class, this system did not save their careers. It facilitated their ruin. It provided the chemical and procedural means to bypass the body's warning systems, allowing them to participate in their own physical dismantling. The medicine of the moment was a pact with the devil, offering the temporary relief needed to execute the next play in exchange for a lifetime of consequences. The centerpiece of this system was the injection. The syringe was as much a part of the pre-game ritual as taping ankles. The most common weapon was the corticosteroid, most famously cortisone. Its function was powerfully simple. It was a nuclear option against inflammation. When injected directly into a swollen joint, a knee, a shoulder, an elbow, it acted as a potent anti-inflammatory, dramatically reducing pain and swelling within hours. The effect was miraculous for a player trying to suit up. But the miracle was a deception. Cortisone did not heal the torn ligament, the frayed tendon, or the bruised bone. It merely silenced the pain signal and reduced the visible swelling, the body's natural protective response to injury. This allowed the player to perform, but in doing so, he placed tremendous stress on an already compromised structure. A quarterback with a cortisone-numbed throwing shoulder could unleash passes with abandon, further tearing the delicate rotator cuff. A quarterback with a shot in his knee could plant and drive, destabilizing a joint whose ligaments were already stretched or torn. The injection masked the damage while enabling its progression. Beyond corticosteroids, there existed a vast, loosely regulated pharmacopoeia of pain management. Powerful oral anti-inflammatories like indomethacin were dispensed like candy, often in dosages that far exceeded recommended civilian guidelines. Narcotic painkillers, Percodan, Vicodin, were readily available for acute pain. The culture of the locker room normalized this chemical reliance. It was not seen as a weakness to need a shot. It was seen as toughness, as dedication to the team. The phrase, "getting a cortisone shot," was uttered with the same casual gravity as "getting taped up." It was a badge of honor. For a quarterback whose value was solely in his ability to perform on Sunday, the pressure to acquiesce to any treatment that would get him on the field was immense. If you refused the shot, you weren't just letting down your teammates. You were inviting doubt about your commitment, your masculinity, your very identity as a football player. The system leveraged the player's own psychology against his long-term health. The administration of this system created a profound ethical conflict for the team medical staff. The team doctor and the trainers were employed by the franchise, not by the players. Their paychecks came from the same organization whose success depended on the quarterback's presence on the field. This created an unavoidable duality of interest. Were they healers, or were they performance enablers? In many cases, the line vanished entirely. The legendary game day injection was a ritual. A player would be evaluated in the training room, his injury assessed. The doctor, knowing the stakes of the game, knowing the coach's expectations, knowing the player's own desire to play, would recommend the shot. Informed consent in this environment was a fiction. What player, in the heat of a playoff race with his coach and teammates depending on him, would truly say no to the magic solution that would let him play? The information about long-term risks, cartilage degeneration, tendon weakening, kidney or liver damage from chronic NSAID use, was rarely part of the conversation. The conversation was about now. This Sunday. This drive. The case of Ken O'Brien, the New York Jets quarterback, provides a window into this world. Following his brutalization in Miami in November of 1985, O'Brien was a walking catalog of injuries. Bruised ribs, a sprained AC joint in his throwing shoulder, a mild concussion, and general musculoskeletal trauma. To prepare for the next game, he underwent a regimen that was standard for the time. He received a cortisone shot in his shoulder to quiet the inflammation from the sprain. His ribs were taped tightly, a process that restricted breathing but provided a semblance of stability. He took anti-inflammatory pills around the clock. For the concussion, there was no protocol. He was asked a few questions. Who are we playing? What's the date? And when he answered correctly, he was cleared. The medicine did not make him healthy. It made him functional. It patched over the broken systems just well enough for him to take the field. But his performance was a chiaroscuro of pain. His throws lacked their usual velocity because he couldn't follow through without a sharp stab in his shoulder. He flinched in the pocket, anticipating hits his body could no longer absorb. The medicine allowed him to be present, but it could not make him whole. It turned him from an injured athlete into a medicated participant, a dangerous transformation. This pharmaceutical culture extended to stimulants as well. While stricter drug testing was on the horizon, the use of amphetamines or greenies was still a whispered part of the game's fabric for some players. For a quarterback battling fatigue, pain, and the mental fog of a concussion, a stimulant could provide a crucial, artificial clarity and energy boost. It could sharpen focus that had been dulled by repeated head trauma. Again, the goal was performance in the moment, not health. The long-term effects of mixing stimulants with painkillers and corticosteroids, while subjecting the body to extreme physical trauma, were unknown and unconscionable. The body became a chemical battlefield, with various drugs enlisted to suppress different protestations from the nervous system. Also, the central command, the player's will, could continue to issue orders. The ultimate tragedy of this medical paradigm is that it was born of a genuine desire to help. Trainers and doctors cared deeply for their players. They hated seeing them in pain. The shots and pills were, in their minds, the tools they had to offer. The science of sports medicine was in its relative infancy. The long-term studies linking corticosteroid overuse to joint degeneration or connecting NSAIDs to kidney failure were not yet part of the standard curriculum. They were operating within a culture and a knowledge base that prioritized immediate return to play. But ignorance does not absolve consequence. The system, however well-intentioned its foot soldiers, served the machine, kept the product on the field. It allowed the spectacle to continue, even as the essential components of that spectacle were being chemically and physically hollowed out. For the quarterbacks of 1985, this medical system was the trapdoor beneath their careers. It allowed them to navigate a season that was physically untenable, but at a cost that would compound for decades. The cortisone that Neil Lomax threw with a ruined back poisoned his kidneys. The anti-inflammatories that allowed others to practice led to gastrointestinal bleeds and organ stress. The painkillers prescribed for acute injuries opened doorways to dependency. The medicine of the moment was a short-term loan with a catastrophic interest rate, and the debt was paid not in games lost, but in quality of life sacrificed. It was the enabler of the destruction, the reason so many of these men didn't just suffer a career-ending injury, but instead played their way, dose by dose, injection by injection, into a permanent state of brokenness. They were not just tackled by defenders. They were betrayed by the very science that was supposed to sustain them. Beyond the broken bones and the numb joints existed a more elusive, more permanent injury, the psychological scar. The violence of the 1985 season did not just damage bodies. It rewired minds. For a quarterback, the pocket is not a physical space defined by his offensive linemen. It is a psychological construct, a sanctuary of time and trust. He must believe on some fundamental level that he will be granted those precious 2.5 seconds to make his read and deliver the ball. The 1985 season systematically destroyed that belief. It replaced it with a constant, low-grade alarm, a hypervigilance that corrupted the very essence of the position. The term for this is happy feet. But that phrase is far too cheerful, too trivial. What developed in the minds of the lost class was a form of athletic PTSD. They began to hear footsteps, not the actual sound of a pass rusher, but the phantom echo of him, a sensory hallucination born of repeated trauma. This was the silent killer of careers. A body could be shot up and taped together. A shattered psyche could not. Ken O'Brien's descent into the shadow world is the most documented, and therefore the most instructive. Before the 1985 season, O'Brien was known for a specific, almost maddening trait, his poise. He had what coaches called a great internal clock. He could sense pressure without seeing it, feel the pocket collapsing in his periphery, and yet he would hold the ball that extra fraction of a second to allow a route to develop. It was this trait that made him a precise, efficient passer. The beating in Miami, and the weekly sieges that followed, shattered that internal clock. The mechanism was broken. After absorbing 20-plus hits in a single game, his subconscious mind rebelled. Could no longer accurately calculate risk. The mathematical equation of the pocket, weighing the progress of receivers against the advance of defenders, became corrupted by a new, overwhelming variable, pain anticipation. His brain, in an effort to protect the body it inhabited, began to signal danger earlier and earlier in his dropback. The result was a quarterback who began to bail on clean pockets, who threw off his back foot when there was no immediate pressure, who looked at the rush instead of downfield. He was seeing ghosts. The film from the latter half of the 1985 season and into 1986 shows a player in a silent argument with himself. You can see the conflict in his footwork. He drops back, his eyes downfield, his mechanics textbook. Then a slight hitch, a stutter step. His eyes dart left, then right, not to read coverage but to scan for threats. The primary receiver comes open, but O'Brien's feet are no longer set. He's already drifting, escaping a pressure that hasn't yet materialized. The throw is late, behind the receiver, or worse, into coverage. The coaches would scream from the sideline, "Stand in there! Deliver the ball!" They saw a failure of nerve. What they were actually witnessing was a sophisticated neurological adaptation. O'Brien's central nervous system had been conditioned. The punishing hits were the stimulus. The flinch, the early escape, was the conditioned response. It was Pavlovian. The pocket itself had become the bell, ringing a warning of imminent pain. This phenomenon was not unique to O'Brien. It was an epidemic. Steve Bertkowski in Atlanta, once a fearless pocket passer with a cannon arm, became increasingly immobile and then increasingly fragile after a series of catastrophic knee injuries. His confidence in his own protection evaporated. He began to throw the ball away at the first sign of color in his periphery, a habit that infuriated coaches but was simply the instinct of a man whose body had been betrayed too many times. David Woodley in Pittsburgh, a quarterback whose talent was always raw, saw his development completely stunted by the constant pressure. He never had the chance to develop a pocket presence because he was never afforded a pocket. He became a scrambler by necessity, his eyes forever down, his progression reads never developing beyond his first option. The game never slowed down for him because it was always a chaotic, violent frenzy. The mental software required to process the game at a high level was never installed. He was too busy running the basic operating system of survival. The defenders of the era understood this psychological component intimately. It was, in fact, a primary objective. Buddy Ryan didn't just want to sack the quarterback. He wanted to affect his psyche. Lawrence Taylor has spoken openly about wanting to hit a quarterback early, to let him know he was there, to make him hear footsteps for the rest of the afternoon. This was strategic terrorism. A single, devastating sack in the first quarter could yield 3 or 4 hurried throws, or intentional grounding penalties in the fourth quarter. The physical hit was the means, the mental colonization was the end. Once a quarterback started hearing those footsteps, once he started double-clutching and looking at the rush, he was defeated. He was no longer a quarterback, he was a survivor, and survival is not a recipe for offensive efficiency. The cruel irony is that this psychological damage often manifested as a decline in toughness or confidence, labels that placed the blame squarely on the quarterback. Fans and media would question his heart. They'd say he was gun-shy. This diagnosis was not only inaccurate, it was a profound injustice. It medicalized a moral failing. What was being described as a lack of courage was, in reality, a logical and deeply ingrained neurological response to repeated trauma. The brain is designed to avoid things that cause extreme pain. When a quarterback like Ken O'Brien, who had demonstrably proven his physical courage by getting up from hit after hit, began to avoid the pocket, it wasn't because he'd become a coward. It was because his brain, that exquisite 3-pound organ responsible for every throw and every decision, was trying to save itself, and the body it commanded, from further destruction. The will was still there. The circuitry was damaged. This mental scar tissue had a longer half-life than any physical injury. A knee could be surgically repaired. A shoulder could be scoped, but how do you surgically remove a memory? How do you rehabilitate a shattered sense of safety? For many of these quarterbacks, the psychological fallout extended far beyond their careers. The hypervigilance, the anxiety, the quick trigger startle response, these did not turn off with the final whistle. They bled into civilian life. The sound of footsteps in a crowd, the sudden movement in a peripheral vision, could trigger a physiological stress response. The mental discipline required to focus through chaos could curdle into an inability to focus in peace. The game had taught their nervous systems to exist in a state of perpetual threat, and for some, that state became a permanent residence. The pocket was gone, but the fear it instilled had moved in to stay. The sound of footsteps, then, is the true legacy of the 1985 season for many of these men. It is the sound of a predator that no longer physically exists, but whose echo continues to shape behavior. It is the sound of trust broken. It is the sound of a clock forever running fast. It is the invisible injury, the one that didn't show up on an X-ray or an MRI, but showed up in every hurried throw, every missed read, every early retirement, and every silent moment of anxiety long after the game was over. Before a body breaks, a mind must accept the risk. The 1985 season broke that contract. It asked the mind to accept the unacceptable, and when the mind rebelled in the only way it knew how, by instilling a pervasive, performance-killing fear, the quarterbacks were blamed for the consequences of the very violence they had been subjected to. They were labeled damaged goods, when in truth, they were the only ones reacting appropriately to the damage being done. The final whistle of the 1985 season did not bring relief. For the healthy, for the champions, it brought celebration and the promise of rest. For the wounded quarterbacks of the lost class, it marked the beginning of a new, more isolating phase of their ordeal. The off-season of the broken. This was the time when the true depth of their injuries was assessed, not in terms of game readiness, but in terms of surgical repair and long-term prognosis. It was a season of silence, severed from the camaraderie of the locker room and the purpose of the game plan. It was a slow-motion race against a calendar that ticked inexorably toward training camp, a race many of them were now physically incapable of winning. While the league's machinery turned its attention to the draft, to free agency, to marketing the next season, these men were trapped in a parallel universe of rehabilitation clinics, operating rooms, and the lonely, grinding work of trying to reassemble a body that the sport had taken apart piece by piece. For Neil Lomax, the offseason was a descent into a world of chronic pain management. The back injury from the Eagles game had not healed. It had settled in. The initial acute trauma had transitioned into a persistent, gnawing condition. His off-season regimen was no longer about building strength and refining technique. It was about managing inflammation. His days revolved around a strict schedule of anti-inflammatory medication, physical therapy focused on stabilizing his core to protect his spine, and cautiously throwing a football to prevent his shoulder from stiffening. There was no clean surgical fix for a spinal contusion. There was only mitigation. Every morning, he awoke to a stiff, aching back that loosened only with heat, stretching, and pills. The Cardinals' training staff monitored him, but their goal was singular. Could he be ready for July? The question of whether further punishment might risk permanent nerve damage or long-term disability was not part of the official conversation. The conversation was about function, not health. Ken O'Brien's off-season was a psychological purgatory. The physical wounds, the bruised ribs, the shoulder sprain, healed within weeks. The concussion symptoms, dismissed during the season, lingered in the form of headaches and fogginess that gradually faded. But the mental injury, the corrupted internal clock, had no rehabilitation protocol. He spent the off-season in California, throwing to receivers, trying to rebuild his mechanics. But the work was haunted. On film, his drops looked clean. In the solitude of a practice field, his footwork was precise. But in his mind's eye, the phantom pressure was always there. He would replay the Miami game in his head, not as a competitor, but as a trauma victim. The silent, sun-drenched fields of the off-season offered no simulation for the roaring chaos of a collapsing pocket. He could rebuild his body, but he couldn't find a clinic to rebuild his nerve. The confidence that had been his hallmark was now a foreign country, and he couldn't remember the way back. For others, The off-season was defined by the cold, bright lights of an operating room. Steve Bertkovsky's knees, battered beyond recognition, required yet another round of surgeries. The procedures in the mid-80s were archaic by today's standards. Arthroscopic surgery was in its infancy. Many procedures were open surgeries, requiring large incisions, longer recovery times, and significant scar tissue buildup. The surgeon's goal was to repair enough functional stability to allow the player to perform, not to restore the joint to its original, pristine condition. Each surgery was a withdrawal from a finite account of cartilage and ligament integrity. Bertkovsky, like many, would rehab tirelessly, pushing through pain to regain range of motion, to rebuild atrophied muscle. But the knee would never be a knee again. It was now a medical device, held together by suture and scar tissue, capable of performing athletic tasks but forever altered, forever vulnerable. This isolating grind was set against the booming, indifferent backdrop of the NFL's business cycle. While Lomax struggled to get out of bed without pain and O'Brien fought his own psyche, the league conducted its annual renewal. The scouting combine measured new, healthy, pliable bodies. The draft, just months after Theismann's leg broke and Lomax's spine was bruised, welcomed a new class of quarterbacks with undamaged limbs and unbroken confidence. Teams publicly expressed support for their injured veterans, but privately, contingency plans were being drawn. Draft boards were adjusted. The message, though unspoken, was clear. The machine must continue. If you cannot rejoin the assembly line by a certain date, you will be replaced. The off-season for the broken was a race against their own potential successors. A brutal irony where a man rehabbed his livelihood while watching his organization audition the candidates to take it from him. The financial pressure was immense and often overlooked. Salaries in the 1980s, while significant, were not the life-altering generational wealth of today's contracts. Many players lived relatively modestly during the season, with their financial security often predicated on a career lasting longer than a few years. An injury that threatened a career was not just a physical crisis. It was an economic emergency. There was no robust guaranteed money. There was no injury protection insurance provided by the league. A player who couldn't pass a physical by a certain date could be cut. His salary voided, his future uncertain. This reality hung over every painful rehab session. It wasn't just about getting back to the game you loved. It was about securing the financial future of your family. This pressure forced players to accelerate timelines, to return before they were truly healed, to hide lingering symptoms from team doctors. The off-season of the broken was thus a high-stakes gamble. Push too hard and risk permanent injury, or rehab too cautiously and risk being deemed expendable. The loneliness was perhaps the most profound injury of all. Football is a tribal sport. Your identity is woven into the fabric of a team. The off-season strips that away for every player, but for the injured, the isolation is absolute. You are not training with your teammates. You are not sharing jokes in the weight room. You are in a clinic or alone on a field or in a pool doing aquatic therapy. The phone calls from coaches grow less frequent. The visits from teammates dwindle. You become a medical project, a file, a problem to be solved. The psychological toll of this separation cannot be overstated. The game, for all its violence, provides purpose and community. The off-season of the broken strips away both, leaving only the pain and the doubt. For men like David Woodley, who struggled with the mental aspects of the game even when healthy, this isolation could be a catalyst for a premature and quiet retirement. The will to fight through the solitary grind simply evaporated. By the time the summer heat arrived and training camps opened in July of 1986, the divide was stark. The league had moved on, energized by new faces and fresh narratives. The Bears were defending champions. Lawrence Taylor was a reigning defensive player of the year. But in Cardinals camp, Neil Lomax took the field with a back that required pre-practice treatment just to allow him to bend. In Jets camp, Ken O'Brien dropped back, his mechanics sharp, his eyes occasionally betraying a flicker of that old hesitation. In Falcons camp, Steve Bertkovsky tested his surgically rebuilt knees, knowing one awkward plant could end everything. They were present, but they were already ghosts of their former selves. The off-season had not been a period of healing. It had been a period of assessment, and the assessment was grim. The 1985 season had not ended in January. For these men, it had simply entered a new, quieter, and more desperate chapter. They had survived the war, but now they had to live in the ruined landscape it left behind. The off-season of the Broken was the quiet prelude to the end of their careers, a slow fade to black that the highlight reels would never show. The National Football League is a sport, a passion, a cultural touchstone. But beneath the helmet decals and the end-zone celebrations, it is, first and foremost, a business. A brutally efficient, multi-billion-dollar corporation with a product to ship every Sunday. And in any efficient business, assets that are damaged, underperforming, or nearing the end of their useful life cycle are managed with cold, pragmatic calculation. For the quarterbacks who were physically and psychologically broken by the 1985 season, the most profound betrayal often did not come on the field from a blitzing linebacker. It came in the quiet offices of the front office, in the language of contracts and salary caps, in the dispassionate eyes of general managers who saw not a wounded leader, but a depreciating asset. The machine had a term for this: football decisions. For the men of the lost class, these decisions were the final administrative blows that ended their careers, transforming them from franchise cornerstones into liabilities to be excised. The economic model of the NFL in the mid-1980s was fundamentally different from today's ecosystem. There was no true free agency. The Plan B system offered limited mobility. Players were largely bound to their teams, and teams held near total control over a player's career trajectory. This power dynamic was absolute when it came to injured players. Contracts were not guaranteed. A standard player agreement contained clauses that allowed a team to terminate the deal if the player failed a physical. This meant that a quarterback like Neil Lomax, whose back was a ticking time bomb of chronic pain, or Steve Burtkowski, whose knees were a mosaic of surgical scars, could be released at any moment, with the team owing him nothing beyond the money already paid. His career, his income, his family's security could vanish with a single line on a termination waiver. This financial sword of Damocles hung over every rehab session, every medical evaluation. It forced players to downplay pain, to rush back, to make themselves available, even when they were far from healthy. The front office perspective was one of risk management. A general manager's primary duty is to field a competitive team within financial constraints. Investing significant salary and hope in a quarterback whose body had been proven fragile was seen as a poor bet. The 1985 season served as the ultimate stress test, and many quarterbacks had failed it catastrophically. The GMs had watched the film. They saw Lomax wincing as he got up from hits. They saw O'Brien's happy feet. They saw Theismann's career end in real time. Their assessment was not emotional. It was actuarial. They began to calculate the probability of another full, productive season from these men. For many, the calculus came up short. The investment was no longer worth the risk. The decision was not if to replace them, but when and with whom. The replacement process was often clinical and devoid of ceremony. While the injured quarterback spent his off-season in lonely rehabilitation, the team's scouting department was aggressively evaluating college prospects. The draft became the primary mechanism for succession. A team might publicly express full confidence in their veteran starter, all while privately grading quarterbacks in the upcoming draft class. When the St. Louis Cardinals selected quarterback Kelly Stouffer in the first round of the 1987 draft, it was not a compliment to Neil Lomax. It was his professional obituary, written in advance. Lomax was now a lame duck. Every incomplete pass, every loss, every moment he reached for his back in pain would be met with calls for the young, healthy, first-round pick. The veteran was no longer playing to win games. He was playing to stave off his own obsolescence. This dynamic created a toxic, pressurized environment that further eroded performance and accelerated the end. For others, the replacement came via trade or the signing of a veteran journeyman. The message was the same: you are no longer the solution, you are the bridge to the next solution, and that bridge is very short. Teams would often keep a damaged veteran for one more season, hoping for a final year of productivity, while his successor learned the system from the sideline. The veteran quarterback knew his role was temporary. that he was a caretaker for his own replacement. This was a profound psychological demotion. The leadership authority that is essential to the position evaporates when the entire organization knows you are a temporary fixture. Teammates' allegiances subtly shift toward the future. Coaches design plays with an eye toward the next year's arm talent. The quarterback becomes a ghost in his own huddle. The financial mechanisms for this transition were often brutal. A player could be asked to take a pay cut, restructuring his contract to reflect his new, diminished status as a backup or a temporary starter. If he refused, he could be cut outright. There was no graceful transition to a mentorship role with a guaranteed salary. It was often a binary choice. Accept a fraction of your worth or be unemployed. For proud men who had been starters and stars, this was a humiliating negotiation. It forced them to put a dollar value on their own diminished skills and broken body. Ken O'Brien, after several seasons of declining performance post-1985, was eventually traded from the Jets to the Green Bay Packers, where he served as a backup. His career did not end with a defining moment on the field. It ended with a series of transactions, a gradual slide down depth charts, his value quantifiably decreasing with each passing season and each new physical ailment. The most chilling aspect of this business process was its normalization. Coaches, general managers, and even the media spoke of turning the page and going in a new direction. These were euphemisms that sanitized the human cost. A football decision was a term that absolved the decision-maker of any moral responsibility for the fate of the player. It was just business. The player's years of service, his sacrifices, his injuries sustained in the team's colors, were reduced to an entry on a balance sheet. His release was not a betrayal. It was a roster move. This linguistic framework protected the institution and insulated the individuals within it from the consequences of their choices. It allowed the machine to consume its components and then dispassionately discard them when they were worn out. For the quarterbacks themselves, this business finale was often more damaging to their sense of self than the initial injury. The hit from Lawrence Taylor or Reggie White was an act of violence from an opponent. It was part of the game's covenant. Being cut by the team you bled for, the organization you believed had your back, was a betrayal of a different order. It revealed the fundamental truth. You were never family. You were labor. Your loyalty was to the logo, but the logo's loyalty was to its own perpetuation. When Neil Lomax was finally released, his body and kidneys failing, the Cardinals organization expressed sympathy, but their focus had long since shifted. The business of replacement had been completed. The asset was written off. The human being was left to navigate the aftermath alone, a casualty not just of sport, but of commerce. This cold economic logic is the engine that drove the NFL's ability to absorb the carnage of 1985 and continue uninterrupted. The quarterbacks were not irreplaceable. The system was designed to replace them. For every Lomax, O'Brien, or Burtkowski whose career was truncated, there was a Stouffer, a Browning, or a Testaverde waiting in the wings, young, healthy, and blissfully unaware of the physical price their predecessors had paid. The business of replacement ensured the product's continuity. It allowed the league to weather the destruction of a generation of players without missing a beat, because the pipeline of new talent was endless, and the contractual control was absolute. The lost class didn't just lose their health and their careers. In the end, they lost their economic value to the only institution they had ever known, and that loss was the final, silent verdict on their worth. The final whistle blows. The jersey is hung up for the last time. The cheering stops. This is the moment fans imagine as the beginning of a peaceful afterlife, a retirement of golf courses, broadcasting booths, and leisurely days. For the men of the lost class of 1986, it was the moment the real accounting began. The body, silenced for years by adrenaline, ambition, and pharmaceuticals, finally presented its bill. The pain that had been managed, suppressed, and ignored during their careers now emerged as the permanent resident of their lives. This was not the acute, sharp pain of a torn ligament or a broken bone, but a chronic, deep, and pervasive ache. The physical echo of every hit absorbed in 1985 and beyond. The body's ledger, kept in the silent language of tissue and nerve, was now due, and the currency was a lifetime of disability. The game had ended, but the suffering had found a new, forever home. The most common entry in this ledger was degenerative arthritis. The brutal mechanics of a sack often involved a quarterback's limbs being twisted into unnatural positions under immense force. The knee, a hinge joint designed for forward and backward motion, would be hit from the side, shearing the cartilage that cushions the bone. The shoulder, a delicate ball and socket marvel of mobility, would be driven into the turf, crushing the rotator cuff and fraying the labrum. At the time, surgeries aimed to restore basic stability and function, to allow the player to throw again, to plant again. They did not aim to restore the joint to its original, pristine state. The result, a decade or two later, was bone grinding on bone. Arthritis set in with a vengeance. For a player like Steve Bertkowski, the simple act of walking became a calculated, painful endeavor. Each step sent jarring vibrations up through his shattered knees, a constant reminder of sacks from players whose names he had long forgotten. The weather became a personal meteorologist. A drop in barometric pressure would announce itself hours in advance through a symphony of throbbing joints. Spinal damage was another devastating line item. The human spine is not engineered to have 300-pound men land on it repeatedly, nor to be driven into the ground with whiplash force. Neil Lomax's back injury was merely the most acute example. Many quarterbacks from that era lived with undiagnosed spinal stenosis, herniated discs, and compressed nerves. These conditions manifested in ways that destroyed quality of life. Chronic, debilitating back pain made sitting for long periods, driving a car, or even playing with children an ordeal. Nerve compression could lead to radiating pain, numbness, or weakness in the limbs, a condition known as neuropathy. The body's central signaling system, the spinal cord, had been traumatized, and the errors were permanent. A man might find his hands going numb while holding a coffee cup, or his foot suddenly giving way on a staircase, not from weakness of will, but from a neurological short circuit caused by a hit he took during the Reagan administration. Then there were the organ systems, quietly failing under the strain of years of chemical management. The case of Neil Lomax's kidney failure is the starkest example, but it was not an isolated one. The long-term, high-dosage use of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs like indomethacin, naproxen, and high-dose ibuprofen, taken daily for years to manage pain and inflammation, is directly toxic to the kidneys. The kidneys filter waste from the blood. These drugs, over time, can reduce blood flow to these vital organs and cause direct cellular damage. For many former players, kidney function declined stealthily, only discovered in routine blood work years later, presenting as hypertension or chronic kidney disease. The liver, tasked with metabolizing painkillers and other medications, also bore a heavy burden. The medicine that had allowed them to perform had, in a terrible irony, poisoned them from within. The treatment became the disease. The cardiovascular system, too, carried hidden wounds. The culture of the 1980s NFL did not prioritize cardiovascular health for linemen or quarterbacks in the way it does today. The focus was on bulk, strength, and power. Many players carried significant weight during their careers. Coupled with the chronic inflammation that is a known byproduct of repetitive traumatic injury, and the potential for undiagnosed sleep apnea from damaged airways or weight issues, the risk for heart disease and stroke in later life skyrocketed. The body, in a state of perpetual low-grade inflammation from old injuries, was essentially aging at an accelerated rate. A man of 50 might have the vascular health of a man of 70, his heart laboring under a burden placed upon it decades earlier. Perhaps the most insidious entries in the ledger were the soft, daily surrenders. It was not being unable to walk, but being unable to kneel. It was not being unable to lift, but being unable to hold a grandchild without a sharp, catching pain in a ruined shoulder. It was the loss of life's simple physical poetry. The spontaneous sprint, the playful wrestling match, the long hike. Their worlds became smaller, circumscribed by pain. Chairs had to be chosen for support, not comfort. Cars had to be selected for ease of entry. Sleep became a fragmented journey, interrupted by the need to shift position to alleviate aching hips or a screaming back. The athletic body, once a source of pride, power, and livelihood, had become a prison of limitations, a catalog of broken parts. This long-term physical toll existed in a vacuum of care. When these men retired, the NFL's responsibility to them effectively ended. There was no comprehensive, league-sponsored health insurance for life. There was no proactive, long-term medical monitoring program to catch kidney disease or cardiovascular issues early. The NFL Players Association was weaker, and benefits were harder to access. Many of these men fought bureaucratic battles for disability benefits, forced to prove to pension boards that their debilitating arthritis was directly related to their football career, a humiliating and often futile process that required them to relive their trauma for indifferent administrators. They were left to navigate the civilian healthcare system alone, often with inadequate insurance, treating chronic conditions that were entirely the product of their service to the league. The body's ledger, therefore, tells the true story of cost. The statistics of the 1985 season, sack numbers, quarterback ratings, wins and losses, are meaningless abstractions compared to this concrete, daily reality of pain. The highlight reel hits that fans cheered did not end when the film stopped rolling. They continued in silent, internal devastation for the next 40 years. A sack was not a 2-second event. It was a lifetime condition. Each quarterback of the lost class became a walking museum of that violent season. Each ache an exhibit, each scar a document. Their lives became a permanent second half, where the score being settled was between the men they once were and the men they had been forced to become. The game had asked for their youth, their talent, their courage. In return, it gave them a body that would forever remember the price they paid, a ledger written in pain, payable over a lifetime. The most profound theft committed by the 1985 season was not of mobility, or even of long-term physical health. It was of the mind itself. While the body's ledger tallied its accounts in arthritis and nerve pain, a deeper, more sinister ledger was being kept within the skull. The brain, that soft, 3-pound universe of memory, personality, and self, is suspended in cerebrospinal fluid, a perfect buffer for gentle motion. It is not designed for the violent, rotational acceleration-deceleration forces of a professional football hit. For the quarterbacks of that era, whose heads were whiplashed on sacks, slammed into turf, and rattled by countless stingers, the damage was often invisible, ignored, and cumulative. The mind scar is the most devastating legacy of all. It is the erosion of identity, the blurring of memory, the unraveling of the very fabric of who a man is. Long after the applause faded, a quieter, more terrifying struggle began in the silent spaces of their own thoughts. The medical understanding of concussions in 1985 was not just primitive, it was dangerously wrong. The prevailing doctrine was one of resilience. A concussion was often called getting your bell rung. It was viewed as a temporary functional disturbance, not a structural brain injury. The protocol was simple. Can you count fingers? Do you know what day it is? If the answer was yes, you were cleared. The concept of second impact syndrome, where a second concussion before the first has healed can cause catastrophic swelling, was not widely understood. The idea that multiple subconcussive hits, the kind absorbed by a quarterback slammed to the ground dozens of times a season, could cause degenerative brain disease was science fiction. This ignorance was the permission slip for disaster. Quarterbacks were not held out of games for dings. They were celebrated for shaking them off. To come out of a game was a sign of weakness. The culture and the science in a tragic confluence told them to play on. The symptoms, however, were very real, even if they were misunderstood. Players described seeing stars or having tunnel vision after a hit. They talked about a fog, a mental cotton wool that made the playbook seem written in a foreign language. They experienced tinnitus, a persistent ringing in the ears that was the sonic signature of trauma. For Ken O'Brien, after the Miami game, the gap in his memory was a black hole where parts of his own life should have been. These were not just dings. These were textbook symptoms of a mild traumatic brain injury. But without the language or the permission to define them as such, the quarterbacks internalized them as personal failures. Was he losing his edge? Was he not tough enough? The confusion and fear became part of the injury itself, a psychological layer on top of the neurological damage. The long-term cognitive effects for many of these men followed a chillingly similar pattern. In retirement, as the physical pain cemented itself, a different kind of fragmentation began. It started with small things, the kind anyone might dismiss. forgetting where you put your keys, losing the thread of a conversation in a noisy room, struggling to recall a familiar name, but then the patterns deepened. Formerly sharp, articulate men found themselves searching for words, their sentences trailing off into frustration. Short-term memory became unreliable. Appointments were missed. Tasks that required multi-step planning, like managing finances or organizing travel, became sources of overwhelming anxiety. The cognitive scaffolding that holds an adult life together began to creak and wobble. For some, the changes were more profound. Irritability and mood swings, common symptoms of frontal lobe injury, could strain marriages and alienate friends. The calm, focused leader in the huddle could become impulsive, volatile, or deeply depressed in civilian life. The calm, focused leader in the huddle could become impulsive, volatile, or deeply depressed in civilian life. The brain's emotional regulation center, battered by years of impacts, no longer functioned smoothly. Depression was endemic, a black dog that many traced not to the end of their career, but to a fundamental change in how their brain processed the world. The world became dimmer, slower, and more frustrating. The joy of retirement was poisoned by a pervasive, ineffable sense of something being wrong inside their own head. This cognitive decline existed for years in a diagnostic vacuum. Doctors would treat the depression or the anxiety with medication, but rarely did anyone connect it to a career in football. The men themselves often didn't make the connection. They attributed their fogginess to aging, to the stress of retirement, to anything but the true cause. It wasn't until the early 2000s, with the publication of Dr. Bennett Omalu's findings on chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, in Mike Webster, that a terrifying light began to dawn. CTE is a degenerative brain disease found in people with a history of repetitive brain trauma. Its symptoms match exactly what many of the lost class were experiencing. Memory loss, confusion, impaired judgment, impulse control problems, depression, and eventually progressive dementia. For the first time, their suffering had a name, a pathology. The fog had a shape. The tragedy of CTE is its latency. It is a disease that announces itself decades after the hits have stopped. The damage done in the 1985 season was a seed planted in the neural tissue, a seed that took 20-30 years to grow into a monstrous, life-consuming weed. By the time symptoms were severe enough for a doctor to suspect CTE, it was far too late. The disease can only be definitively diagnosed posthumously, through examination of the brain tissue. This meant that living with the mind scar was also living with a terrifying question. Do I have it? Every forgotten name, every moment of confusion, every bout of rage was potentially a symptom of an incurable degenerative disease. The past wasn't just painful, it was potentially fatal. The psychological toll of this knowledge is itself a kind of trauma. To realize that the game you loved, the source of your identity and your greatest achievements, is also the source of an illness that is stealing your mind, is an unbearable paradox. It forces a brutal reevaluation of an entire life. Was it worth it? The question echoes in the silent spaces between lost thoughts. For men already struggling with cognitive function, this existential dread compounds the practical difficulties. It breeds isolation, paranoia, and a deep, resonant grief for the self that is slowly slipping away. The mind scar, therefore, is the ultimate betrayal. The body's pain can be measured, imaged, and to some degree treated. The mind's erosion is a theft of the soul. It takes the memories of the very glory days it was earned in. It isolates a man from his family just when he needs them most. It turns the tool of his success, his brilliant, strategic, resilient mind, against him. The quarterbacks of 1985 were taught to be fearless, to stare down pressure, to be the smartest man on the field. They could not have known that the price for that courage would be paid not with their bodies, but with their minds, that the very organ that made them special would be the one sacrificed to the violence it orchestrated. The sound of footsteps may have faded, but the silence that replaced it was filled with a new, more terrifying noise. The sound of a self, quietly coming apart. The carnage of the 1985 season and its grim aftermath could not be ignored forever. A tectonic pressure was building beneath the league's foundation. The broken bodies and silenced careers of the lost class were not merely tragic anecdotes. They were early warning tremors. By the late 1980s, the whispers of concern from doctors, the quiet grievances of players, and the cold, financial anxiety of owners who saw their star assets being destroyed began to coalesce into a roar that demanded a response. The NFL, an institution resistant to change and protective of its warrior mythology, was finally forced to act. But the impetus was not primarily compassion. It was capitalism. The league had to choose between preserving the unchecked violence that defined its product and protecting the very marketable stars that product relied upon. The resulting rule changes, implemented in the years following 1985, were a revolution born of sheer necessity. They marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, an admission that the game had become too lethal for its own good. The calculus was stark. The quarterback is the single most important and marketable position in professional sports. He is the face of the franchise, the centerpiece of marketing campaigns, the engine of offensive television ratings. The destruction of a generation of quarterbacks was not just a football problem. It was a business crisis. Fans tuned in to watch Joe Montana, Dan Marino, John Elway. They did not tune in to watch their backups, or to see a parade of anonymous journeymen getting hospitalized every Sunday. The 1985 season proved that the defensive revolution had become too efficient. It was threatening to kill the golden goose. Owners and league executives began to understand that the relentless, graphic violence they had sold as entertainment was now undermining the stability and star power of their own league. They faced a simple choice: protect the passer or watch their most valuable commodities become extinct. The first major shift was a subtle but profound change in the enforcement of existing rules, particularly the in-the-grasp provision. In the wake of Theismann's injury and the weekly pummeling of other passers, the league office sent a quiet directive to officials: blow the play dead sooner. The subjective interpretation of clearly immobilized was tightened. If a quarterback was in the grasp of a defender and his forward progress was stopped, the whistle was to be blown, even if he was still upright. This was a direct attempt to prevent the second and third hits that caused so much unnecessary damage. It was met with fierce resistance from defensive purists and coaches, who saw it as softening the game. But the league held firm. The era of the quarterback as a piñata, surrounded by defenders taking free shots until he hit the ground, was being deliberately phased out. The most significant formal change came in 1988. The competition committee, influenced by the gruesome film from 1985 and the declining health of veterans, instituted new, more stringent rules regarding hits on the quarterback. The language around roughing the passer was expanded and clarified. A defender was now prohibited from hitting the passer below the knees unless he was blocked or fouled into him. Driving the quarterback into the ground with all or most of the defender's weight became a penalty. Most importantly, the rules now explicitly penalized a forcible hit to the quarterback's head or neck area, even if it was deemed incidental to a wrapping tackle. This was a monumental shift. It acknowledged that the helmet-to-helmet collision was not an acceptable byproduct of play. It was a dangerous, illegal act. The strike zone for a legal hit was now officially narrowed to the torso. The enforcement of these rules was initially inconsistent, as officials and players adjusted. Defensive players howled that they were being turned into flag football participants. Coaches like Buddy Ryan derided the changes as ruining the game. But the league office, for the first time, began to back the officials with fines and suspensions for egregious hits. The message was no longer ambiguous. The league was drawing a line in the sand. The quarterback, once considered fair game for any legal violence, was now a protected species. This cultural shift within the league's own governance was the true watershed. It represented a fundamental reprioritization. The aesthetic of violence was being downgraded in favor of the sustainability of offensive talent. The impact on the game was both immediate and long-lasting. Sack numbers, which had peaked in the mid-80s, began a slow, steady decline. Quarterback completion percentages and passer ratings began a corresponding rise. Offensive schemes evolved to take advantage of the extra half-second of protection. The West Coast offense, with its quick, timing-based throws, flourished in this new environment. The pocket became more stable. Quarterback careers began to lengthen. The era of the 40-year-old quarterback, a rarity before, was born from these rule changes. Men like Warren Moon, Rich Gannon, and later Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers owed their longevity not just to improved training, but to a rulebook that now actively shielded them from the kind of systematic destruction that ended the careers of the lost class. For the quarterbacks who had been sacrificed, these changes were a bittersweet vindication. They watched from retirement as the league they loved adopted the protections they had desperately needed a decade earlier. Ken O'Brien has said in interviews that seeing the new rules was like watching someone finally install a guardrail on a cliff he had been forced to drive off of years before. There was relief that others would be spared, but also a profound sense of melancholy and injustice. The rules proved that the violence they endured was not an essential, immutable part of the game. It was a choice, and the league had chosen to change only after their bodies had been used as the evidence to justify it. They were the control group in a brutal experiment, the proof of concept that allowed for a safer, more profitable future. The whispers of 1985, the snap of a leg, the pop of a shoulder, the silent concussion, had indeed become a roar by the end of the decade. But it was a roar of commerce, not conscience. The NFL did not save the quarterback out of kindness. It saved him because he was more healthy than broken. The rule changes of the late 80s and early 90s were the league's pragmatic, belated answer to the carnage it had authored. They marked the end of the wilderness, the close of a lawless period where anything short of murder in the pocket was tolerated. A new covenant was written, one that traded unlimited violence for sustained star power. The lost class of 1986 never benefited from this new deal. They were the last lost generation to play under the old, brutal Constitution, a document written in their own blood and bone. The narrative of the 1985 season has, thus far, been framed through the lens of the prey, the quarterbacks who were broken, both in body and spirit. But to understand the full moral complexity of that era, we must turn our attention to the predators. The men who delivered the hits were not cartoon villains. They were elite athletes, celebrated and rewarded for executing their assigned tasks with violent perfection. They operated within the rules as they were understood and enforced. They were the product of a system that demanded and glorified their particular brand of mayhem. Yet, in the years that followed, as the league pivoted to protect quarterbacks, these hunters found their legacy complicated, their achievements subtly downgraded, and their very craftsmanship condemned by the same institution that had once placed them on its highest pedestal. For Lawrence Taylor, Richard Dent, and their defensive brethren, the rule changes that ended the slaughter were a personal and professional reckoning. They had been kings of a jungle that was suddenly being civilized, and they were left to wonder if their crowns were now made of tin. Lawrence Taylor's perspective is the most iconic and tortured. He was the archetype, the nonpareil. He revolutionized his position and by extension defensive football. The hit that ended Joe Theismann's career haunts him not out of guilt for playing hard, but out of the visceral human horror of the outcome. In numerous interviews, Taylor has expressed a profound respect for Theismann and a lingering distress over the graphic nature of the injury. But he has also expressed a consistent, unwavering belief about his own role. He was doing his job. He was playing the game the way it was taught, coached, and celebrated. "I didn't go out there to hurt anybody," Taylor has said, "but I did go out there to hit the quarterback, to make him not want to get up." This is the essential conflict. His intention was to dominate, to intimidate, to impose his will, all qualities the NFL sold to its fans. The catastrophic injury was a potential, even accepted, byproduct of that mandate, but never the explicit goal. When the rules changed, Taylor felt a sense of betrayal. The league was fundamentally altering the game he had mastered, rendering aspects of his genius obsolete. The very things that made him Lawrence Taylor, the unblockable speed, the terrifying power, the willingness to finish every hit, were being legislated into a lower, softer form of football. For the 1985 Chicago Bears defense, arguably the greatest unit of all time, the legacy is equally tangled in irony. They were the apex predators of the apex predatory era. Buddy Ryan's 46 defense was a masterpiece of organized violence. A scheme designed to create one-on-one matchups his players were expected to win with brutal efficiency. Richard Dent, Dan Hampton, Steve McMichael, Otis Wilson, they were lauded as heroes, as the engine of a championship team. Their highlights, set to the Super Bowl shuffle, are the defining football images of the mid-'80s. But their style of play is extinct. The techniques they used, the head slaps, the borderline late hits, the systematic intimidation of the quarterback, are now either illegal or heavily penalized. When they watch modern football, they see a game that has been sanitized for the protection of the men they were paid to destroy. There is a palpable sense of "we couldn't play today," but it's not uttered as a lament of weakness. It's stated as a fact of a changed world. Their greatness is locked in a specific, vanished time. It can be admired, but it cannot be replicated because the league decided the cost of replicating it was too high. This created a peculiar form of historical whiplash. These defenders were told from the moment they entered the league that their value was measured in sacks, in forced fumbles, in impact plays. Coaches like Buddy Ryan didn't just tolerate aggression. They demanded it. The film sessions glorified the biggest hits. The league's own marketing department turned them into superheroes of violence. Then, within a few short years, the narrative began to shift. The same league, through its rules committee and public relations arm, began to speak about player safety and protecting the integrity of the game. The subliminal message to the defenders of the '80s was, what you did, the way you played, was wrong. It was dangerous and excessive. The celebration turned to caution. The hunter, once crowned, was now being gently scolded. This recalibration extended to the Hall of Fame. While legends like Taylor and Dent are rightly enshrined in Canton, their enshrinement speeches often contain a defensive, justificatory tone. They speak of the era they played in, contextualizing their violence as a product of its time. It is a necessary framing because, judged by the standards of the 21st century, some of their most famous hits would draw suspensions and massive fines. They must argue for their greatness within a historical bubble because the game evolved to explicitly reject the methods that made them great. This is a unique burden. Jerry Rice doesn't have to explain that his routes were legal for his time. They still are. But a pass rusher from 1985 must forever explain that the head slap or the quarterback drive into the turf was not a dirty play, but a standard legal tactic. Their legacy requires an asterisk of context that others do not. Furthermore, many of these defenders are now confronting their own physical and cognitive debts. They absorbed and delivered countless collisions. They are not immune to the arthritis, the joint replacements, the neurodegenerative fears. They played the same game with the same primitive medical care and the same culture of pain-killing injections. Their glory came at the same price, even if it was deferred. This shared physical fate creates a tragic kinship with the quarterbacks they hunted. They are all survivors of the same war, living with similar wounds, differentiated only by the side of the line they stood on when the shells were falling. The animosity of competition has faded, replaced by the mutual understanding of men who broke their bodies for a paycheck and for glory, and who now face the long, painful reconciliation with that choice. The bitter legacy of the hunters, then, is one of profound contradiction. They were simultaneously the heroes of their age and the catalysts for its end. They were celebrated for perfecting a style of play that the league ultimately deemed unsustainable. They are remembered as legends, but their legend is caveat. Their highlights sometimes viewed through a wince rather than a roar of approval. They won championships, defined an era, and changed the game forever. And then the game changed in a way that rendered their most fearsome attributes into relics. They are the last of a breed, and their testimony is essential not to assign blame, but to understand the complete ecosystem of violence. They were not monsters. They were exemplary employees, performing their duties to the exact specifications provided. When the specifications changed, they were left as monuments to a discarded philosophy, forever proud, forever conflicted, forever wondering what their greatness would have looked like in a world that no longer wanted what they had to sell. To witness the modern NFL quarterback is to observe a different species of athlete operating under a different covenant with the game. He stands in a pocket that is, by rule and by design, a sanctuary. The rules enacted in the wake of the 1985 Carnage have been continuously refined and fiercely enforced. A hand brushing his helmet draws a flag. A tackle that drives him forcefully into the turf sparks fines and suspensions. He is swaddled in layers of technological armor, advanced helmet designs, wearable sensors that track impact force, sideline concussion spotters with the authority to remove him from the game. His training is year-round, focused not just on strength, but on kinetic efficiency and injury prevention. His nutrition is scientifically calibrated. His throwing mechanics are dissected by biomechanists to reduce wear on his joints. He is a multimillion-dollar asset, and the entire apparatus of a franchise is dedicated to his preservation and optimization. This is the generation that inherited the game saved by the sacrifices of the lost class. And the question that hangs in the air, unspoken and profound, is this: do they understand the debt they owe? Consider the trajectory of a modern elite quarterback. Let's call him Tommy Touchdown O'Connell, a fictional composite of the modern archetype. He is drafted in the first round. From his first minicamp, he is handled with care. His practice reps are meticulously managed to avoid arm fatigue. He has a personal nutritionist, a mobility coach, a throwing coach, and a mental performance specialist. In games, the rules are his invisible shield. The Tom Brady rule of 2009 makes it illegal for a defender on the ground to lunge at a quarterback's legs. The Aaron Rodgers rule further clarifies what constitutes a permissible sack. Roughing the passer calls are frequent and controversial, a testament to the league's institutional priority. When O'Connell takes a hard hit, he is immediately escorted to the blue medical tent on the sideline, where an independent neurologist runs him through a battery of tests. The decision to return him to play is taken out of the hands of the coach. His career expectancy is not 5 or 7 brutal years. It is 15 or more. He can realistically envision playing into his 40s, his body protected, his brain monitored, his wealth secured by fully guaranteed contracts. Now, let us imagine a conversation across time. Let us place Tommy O'Connell in a room with Ken O'Brien or Neil Lomax. O'Connell speaks of managing the pocket, of reading coverage, of his training regimen that includes Pilates and cryotherapy. O'Brien speaks of survival. He speaks of looking at film to identify which defender would be unblocked each week, and mentally preparing for the hit he knew was coming. He speaks of the shots, the pills, the fog. O'Connell's challenges are cerebral and strategic. The lost class's challenges were existential and physical. The gap between their experiences is not just a generation. It is a chasm carved by the broken bodies of the men who came before. This divide creates a complex, often unacknowledged psychology among the modern players. There is a subtle condescension at times, a belief that they are simply better, more skilled, more durable. They see the old film, the lumbering linemen, the simpler schemes, and mistake survival for a lack of sophistication. They do not fully comprehend the sheer, unregulated violence that defined every passing down. When a modern quarterback complains about a borderline roughing call, he is operating within a framework of expected protection. The quarterbacks of 1985 operated within a framework of expected pain. The mindset is fundamentally alien. The modern player's confidence is born of stability and protection. The old player's confidence was born of defiance in the face of guaranteed punishment. Yet, within some of today's wiser veterans, there exists a palpable sense of gratitude and humility. Players like Aaron Rodgers have openly studied the old film not just for schemes but for context. They marvel at the hits absorbed by men like Burt Jones or Archie Manning. They understand that their own longevity and statistical dominance are directly enabled by the rule changes that those men's suffering precipitated. They recognize that they are the beneficiaries of a brutal historical transaction. This recognition is the closest thing to an inheritance the lost class ever received. The respectful, somber acknowledgement from a successor that the throne they sit upon was paid for with someone else's blood and bone. The financial gap only deepens the historical rift. Neil Lomax's highest annual salary was a fraction of what a modern backup quarterback makes. His post-career medical expenses, his dialysis, his transplant, these were his personal burdens to bear. Tommy O'Connell, through the modern collective bargaining agreement, has access to lifetime health insurance, generous pension plans, and disability benefits that, while still imperfect, are light years beyond what was available in the 1980s. The modern player is a wealthy employee with benefits. The players of the lost class were disposable contractors, used up and cast aside with little more than a handshake and a severance check. This economic disparity is a concrete measure of their sacrifice. The league learned that to maintain its talent, it had to pay for it not just in salary, but in long-term care. The lost class was the last generation to be fully expendable. For the survivors of 1985, watching this new era evokes a storm of emotions. There is pride in seeing the game thrive, a game they still love. There is validation in seeing the protections they needed finally implemented. But there is also an inescapable, corrosive sense of injustice. They see the careful management of a minor ankle sprain for a modern star, and they remember being injected to the point of numbness to play with torn ligaments. They see a quarterback fined for a dangerous hit, and they remember entire seasons where such hits were weekly occurrences without consequence. The contrast is a daily reminder that their pain was not inevitable. It was permitted. It is proof that the league could have acted sooner, but chose not to until the economic calculus demanded it. The generation gap, therefore, is the living space between regret and progress. On one side, the men who were the cost. On the other, the men who are the dividend. The modern game is safer, more spectacular, and more lucrative because the league was forced to confront the destruction it had unleashed. The quarterbacks of today are the children of that confrontation. They play a game that has been edited with the most violent scenes cut out. They owe their careers, their health, and their wealth to a revision of history that occurred just a few years after the lost class left the stage. They play on a field that was, quite literally, leveled by the fallen bodies of the men who came before them. The gap is not just a measure of time or talent. It is a measure of sacrifice, and whether that sacrifice has been honored or merely exploited to build a brighter, safer, more profitable future for everyone else. For decades, the injuries of football were catalogued and understood as discrete local events. A broken leg was a broken leg. A torn knee ligament was an orthopedic problem. A concussion was a temporary neurological glitch. The body was treated as a collection of unrelated systems, and medicine addressed each failure in isolation. This mechanistic view allowed the NFL to manage its wounded, patching up one part while ignoring the cascading consequences to the whole. But the human body is not a machine with replaceable parts. It is an interconnected ecosystem, a symphony of interdependent functions. The emerging, terrifying understanding of the late 1990s and early 2000s was that the damage inflicted in places like the 1985 season did not stay contained. A hit to the knee could whisper to the brain. A shattered vertebra could shout to the kidneys. And the relentless, whole-body trauma of a professional football career could weave a web of degeneration that would ultimately ensnare the mind itself. The unseen connection between the orthopedic devastation of that era and the neurodegenerative crisis that followed is the final, horrifying legacy of the violence. It reveals that the quarterbacks of the lost class were not just suffering from separate ailments. They were experiencing the systematic collapse of a human being. The theory begins with the concept of the weakened vessel. Consider the physics of a severe orthopedic injury, like Neil Lomax's spinal contusion or a catastrophic knee dislocation. These are not just injuries to a specific joint. They are massive systemic insults. The body's response is a flood of inflammatory cytokines, chemical signals of distress that circulate throughout the entire system, creating a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation. This inflammatory state is a known accelerant for a host of diseases, from cardiovascular illness to neurodegenerative conditions. Furthermore, a major injury alters a player's biomechanics. Lomax, throwing with a compromised spine, overstressed his shoulder. A quarterback favoring a destroyed knee placed unequal weight on his hips and back, inviting new injuries. The body was forced into dysfunctional, compensatory patterns that placed strain on other, previously healthy structures. The initial injury was not an endpoint. It was a pathogen, spreading dysfunction throughout the organism. Now, layer upon this the brain's specific vulnerability. For years, the focus was on the iconic, knockout concussion the player carried off the field. But the more profound danger, scientists like Dr. Bennett Omalu and Dr. McKee began to reveal, was repetitive subconcussive trauma. These are the hits that don't cause immediate, diagnosable concussion symptoms but still cause the brain to slosh violently against the hard walls of the skull. Every sack where a quarterback's head snapped back and hit the turf was a subconcussive event. Every time he was driven into the ground, his brain experienced acceleration-deceleration forces. In 1985, a quarterback could easily experience dozens of these subconcussive events in a single game and hundreds over a season. The brain, in this model, is not being bruised in one location. It is being slowly, relentlessly stirred. The delicate tau proteins that stabilize neurons are sheared and damaged, beginning a pathological process that can take decades to manifest as confusion, rage, or dementia. Here is where the connection becomes devastatingly clear. A player with a chronic, painful orthopedic injury is a player whose brain is already under siege from systemic inflammation. He is also a player whose physical limitations, a stiff back, an unstable knee, make him less agile, less able to brace for or avoid hits. He becomes a more stationary, more vulnerable target, absorbing cleaner, more forceful blows to his head and spine. The orthopedic injury begets more neurological trauma. Furthermore, the pharmaceutical regimen used to manage the pain, the high-dose NSAIDs and the corticosteroids, may have unintended neurological consequences. Chronic inflammation is a key suspect in the development of neurodegenerative diseases. Suppressing the symptom, pain, does not address the underlying inflammatory state that might be fueling the brain's decline. The medicine that allowed them to play may have been quietly exacerbating the long-term threat to their minds. The story of a player like Ken O'Brien fits this model precisely. The 1985 season delivered the acute orthopedic and concussive trauma. The bruised ribs, the shoulder sprain, the diagnosed concussion. But it was the subsequent years, playing with altered mechanics and the psychological scars of happy feet, that likely delivered the repetitive subconcussive blows. His compromised pocket presence meant he took more sacks, more hits, more whiplash. His career became a sustained exercise in accumulating brain trauma, not from one big hit, but from 1,000 smaller ones, all set against a backdrop of chronic pain and inflammation from his other injuries. His later life cognitive struggles, the memory lapses, the word-finding difficulties reported by those close to him, are not a separate tragedy from his physical beating. They are its ultimate expression. This pattern extends beyond the quarterback. While our focus is the lost class, the defensive players who hunted them are succumbing to the same unseen connection. The very act of delivering a violent tackle subjects the tackler's brain to similar forces. Men like Mike Webster, the Hall of Fame center for the Pittsburgh Steelers who played through the 70s and 80s, became the early tragic poster children for CTE. His story was one of spectacular physical toughness, playing with broken bones, torn muscles, followed by a descent into homelessness, dementia, and early death. His brain tissue revealed severe CTE. Webster was not a quarterback taking sacks. He was an interior lineman delivering hits on every play. His case proved that the disease was not about one position, but about the cumulative, repetitive trauma inherent in the style of play that reached its zenith in the era surrounding 1985. The hunters and the hunted were being felled by the same invisible enemy. For the families of the lost class, this medical understanding arrived too late. It provided a name, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, for the nightmare they were already living. It explained the personality changes, the irrational anger, the deep depression, the memory loss that they had struggled for years to attribute to something else. It connected the dots between the young man who was carried off a field in 1985 and the older man who could no longer remember his grandchildren's names. The diagnosis, even if only suspected, brought a terrible clarity. It meant their husband's or father's suffering was not a personal failing, not a weakness of character, but a predictable physical disease. It was a disease contracted in the line of duty, an occupational hazard that was never disclosed, never warned against, and for decades actively denied. The unseen connection, therefore, closes a cruel circle. The 1985 season was celebrated for its defensive violence, a violence that broke bones and ended careers. But that violence was merely the visible first act. The second act played out over decades, in the silent internal decay of the brain. The orthopedic injuries were the opening move in a biological chess game that ended with checkmate of the mind. The league's failure was not just in allowing the broken legs and the shattered knees. It was a failure to comprehend, or a refusal to acknowledge, that causing that level of whole-body trauma was tantamount to poisoning a player's future. A sack was not a play. It was a package of consequences, delivered immediately to the joints, and deferred with interest to the brain. We are left with a haunting medical truth. The men who walked away from the 1985 season, even those who walked away under their own power, never really left it behind. The season was injected into their joints, infused into their bloodstreams through pills and needles, and etched into the very folds of their brains. The unseen connection guarantees that the past is always present, a ghost in the machine of their bodies, a silent scream in the circuitry of their minds. The highlight reels have ended. The pain has not. The game has moved on. Their bodies have not. This is the ultimate, devastating cost of that legendary season. It was not a year of their lives they gave. It was the rest of their lives they surrendered, one hit, one pill, one forgotten memory at a time. The field is empty now. The ghosts have all gone home. But if you stand in the silence of an abandoned stadium, you can still feel the echo of it all. The roar, the collision, the silence that followed. The reckoning for the 1985 season is not a single event, a press conference, or a legal settlement. It is a slow, perpetual tide of consequence, washing over the lives of the men who played in it, the institution that profited from it, and the sport that was forever changed by it. 40 years on, the season that destroyed a generation of quarterbacks exists in a dual state, as a celebrated, mythologized chapter in NFL history, and as a private, painful wound that has never fully healed. The reckoning is the ongoing tension between these two truths. It is the question of what we choose to remember, and what we have tried so hard to forget. To find the men of the lost class today is to embark on a journey into quietude. They are not in the broadcast booths. They are not on the celebrity golf circuit. They are men in their 60s and 70s, living with the weather of their past in their bones. Neil Lomax, after his kidney transplant, found a measure of stability, but his health remains a fragile negotiation. He has spoken publicly about his ordeal, his voice a calm, factual recitation of a medical nightmare, but the physical toll is a daily, private reality. The connection between the shots he took for his back and the dialysis machine he was tethered to for a decade is, to him, an unbroken line. He represents the clearest case of cause and effect, a living testament to the body's long memory for punishment. Ken O'Brien, more private, has granted interviews in fits and starts over the years. In them, you see a mind still sharp, still analytical, but one that carefully navigates around the trauma. He speaks of the 1985 Dolphins game not with anger, but with the detached awe of a natural disaster survivor. He has said, "You don't ever really forget what that feels like, to be that overmatched." The psychological scar is visible not in what he says, but in the careful spaces between his words. He coaches high school football now, teaching a new generation a safer, more technical game. There is a poetic justice in that. The man who was a victim of the era's brutality now dedicates himself to instructing young men in its controlled, modern form. His legacy is one of silent endurance and gentle correction. Others have vanished into a more complete obscurity. Their names appear only in database footnotes or in the answers to trivia questions. Their lives after football were shaped by the limitations their careers imposed. Some found success in business, their competitive drive channeled into new arenas. Others struggled, the transition from the structured, adrenalized world of the NFL to the formless quiet of retirement proving too great, especially when compounded by chronic pain and cognitive fog. For every player who speaks out, there are several who have chosen or have been forced by their circumstances to live with their history in silence. Their reckoning is a solitary one, fought in doctors' offices and in the quiet moments of the night when the past feels more real than the present. The NFL's institutional reckoning has been a story of reluctant, incremental, and legally forced evolution. The league did not wake up in 1986 with a newfound moral conscience. It was pushed year by year, lawsuit by lawsuit, scientific study by scientific study. The 2011 collective bargaining agreement and the subsequent concussion settlement with thousands of former players was a watershed, a multi-billion-dollar admission that the game had caused profound harm. But even that was a financial maneuver, a calculated risk transfer, not an apology. The league's narrative has always been one of progress. The game is safer now than it has ever been. This is true. But this statement of progress is also an implicit indictment of the past. It is an acknowledgement that the game the lost class played was not safe, that it was, in fact, destructively dangerous. The NFL's reckoning is therefore a paradox. It must celebrate its history to sell its mythology, while simultaneously distancing itself from the very violence that made that history so compelling. For the fans, the reckoning is an emotional and ethical dilemma. We are the consumers of the product. Our cheers are the soundtrack to the violence. The 1985 Chicago Bears defense is one of the most beloved units in sports history. We cannot separate our fandom from its foundation in controlled brutality. To reckon with 1985 is to admit a complicity, however passive. It is to watch those old highlights of Richard Dent sacking a quarterback and feel two things at once. The thrill of athletic dominance, and a wince of knowing what that sack might have meant for that man's life 40 years later. Our reckoning is about holding two contradictory truths in our minds. That something can be both breathtakingly beautiful and profoundly destructive. That our entertainment was someone else's sacrifice. The most profound reckoning, however, belongs to the sport itself. Football is a Darwinian organism. It adapts to survive. The 1985 season was an evolutionary pressure point. The predators had become so efficient they threatened to collapse the ecosystem by eliminating the most important prey. The rule changes that followed were not kindness. They were natural selection. The sport evolved a new set of traits. Offensive favoritism, quarterback protection, a focus on speed and space over blunt force trauma. The game that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s was different, more sustainable, and even more popular. The lost class of quarterbacks were, in the cruelest biological sense, a necessary die-off. Their suffering was the data that proved the old model was unsustainable. They were the casualties of the sport's evolution. And so we are left with the unresolved present. The modern player is healthier, wealthier, and better protected. He is also an heir to a legacy of pain he did not incur. The league is more accountable, more scientific, and more financially secure than ever. It is also forever shadowed by the consequences of its former neglect. The fan is more knowledgeable, more aware of CTE, more conflicted. And the men of 1985? They are the living bridge between then and now. They are the before picture. Every time a modern quarterback gets up from a roughing the passer penalty, he is benefiting from the lessons written in their broken bodies. Every time the league announces a new safety initiative, it is building upon the ruin of their careers. The final reckoning, then, is not about blame or absolution. It is about acknowledgement. It is about looking at the glorious, violent tapestry of the 1985 NFL season and seeing not just the brilliant threads of champions, but the frayed, cut threads of the men who were broken by it. It is about understanding that history is written by the victors, but paid for by the lost. The story of that season is incomplete if it only chronicles the triumph of the Bears. It must also chronicle the silent fall of Lomax, the long fade of O'Brien, the premature ends of so many others. The field is empty, but it is never truly empty. It is filled with the echoes of all that happened there. The echo of a spiral, and the echo of the sack that ended it. The echo of a cheer, and the echo of a bone breaking. The echo of a career's beginning, and the echo of a life's permanent alteration. The 1985 season happened. It was magnificent and it was terrible. It made legends and it destroyed men. The reckoning is the ongoing effort to listen to all of those echoes at once, to hear the full, complicated, painful truth of what a game can cost. We began this journey in silence, the kind that follows the crowd's last roar. We end it in a different, more profound quiet, the quiet of reckoning. The story of the 1985 season and the generation of quarterbacks it destroyed is not a simple parable of right and wrong. It is a mosaic of courage and cruelty, of innovation and ignorance, of breathtaking spectacle and profound human cost. To look at it squarely is to understand the central, enduring contradiction of American football. It is a culture that exalts the warrior and a business that consumes him. The men of the lost class were not victims of a single bad hit or a lone villain. They were caught in the gears of a machine that was perfectly executing its design. The machine's purpose was to produce excitement, drama, and profit. It did so magnificently, and they were its fuel. The legacy of that season is written in two languages. One is the language of legacy and legend. It is found in the record books, in the highlights of the 85 Bears, in the enduring mythology of Lawrence Taylor's predatory genius. This is the language the League prefers. It is the story of greatness forged in fire. The other language is one of medical charts, of disability claims, of pharmaceutical dependencies, and of cognitive decline. It is spoken in the quiet voices of men now in their 60s, in the testimonies of widows, in the findings of neuropathologists. This is the story of the price extracted for that greatness. Both stories are true. The reckoning lies in our ability and our willingness to hold them both in our minds at once. To celebrate the game, we must also account for its casualties. The NFL, as an institution, has mastered the art of managed evolution. It absorbs criticism, settles lawsuits, implements incremental safety reforms, and moves forward. The game today is objectively safer. The rules protecting quarterbacks are stringent and seriously enforced. The protocols for head injury are light years beyond the how many fingers era. The league points to this progress as evidence of its virtue, and to a degree this is fair. The game has changed, but this narrative of progress serves another purpose. It allows the league to compartmentalize its past. The suffering of the lost class becomes a relic of a more primitive time, a tragedy of outdated knowledge, rather than a direct consequence of a business model that prioritized product over person. This is the most convenient reckoning, to frame the violence of that era as an unavoidable growing pain, rather than a deliberate choice. But choices were made. The choice to glorify the most violent hits on weekly highlight reels. The choice to employ a rulebook with gray areas the size of canyons and to encourage officials to let them play. The choice to foster a medical culture where injections and pills were tools of availability, not healing. The choice to market the warrior mythology while providing no long-term safety net for the warriors. These were not accidents of history. They were the policies of a supremely successful entertainment corporation. The quarterbacks of 1985 did not play in a vacuum. They played in a system engineered to produce the very outcomes that ruined them. Their individual toughness was the variable the system exploited to its limit. For the fans, our reckoning is more personal, more intimate. We are the reason the machine exists. Our passion, our loyalty, our television subscriptions, our jersey purchases, we are the market. The violence of 1985 was not an abstract evil. It was a feature we enjoyed. We gasped at Theismann's injury, but we cheered the hits that led up to it. We marveled at the Bears' defense and reveled in its brutality. Our complicity is passive, but it is real. To love this game is to accept a moral tension. We must reconcile our admiration for the courage of the players with the knowledge that the game asks for, and often takes too much. Our fandom is a partnership in a beautiful, dangerous enterprise. Acknowledging the darkness is not a betrayal of the sport. It is a deeper, more honest form of respect for the people who play it. What, then, of the men themselves? The Neil Lomaxes, the Ken O'Briens, the others whose names have faded? Their reckoning has been a lifelong negotiation with pain and memory. They live with a specific, haunting knowledge that their greatest professional achievement, reaching the pinnacle of the NFL, is inextricably linked to their greatest personal suffering. The very thing that defined them also broke them. This is the cruelest knot of all. Many would say they would do it again, and they mean it. The identity of NFL quarterback is so powerful, so all-consuming, that it can justify almost any cost. This does not mitigate the league's responsibility. It reveals the depth of the player's commitment, a commitment the league was all too willing to exploit. The question of, was it worth it? Is ultimately theirs alone to answer, in the private chambers of their own conscience and their own suffering. For some, the answer may be yes, colored by pride and filtered through the softening lens of time. For others, watching their bodies and minds fail, The answer may be a more complicated, anguished silence. Our role is not to answer for them, but to listen, to ensure their experience is not erased by the march of progress, but is instead remembered as the necessary, terrible cost of that progress. The story of the 1985 season is, in the end, a foundational American story. It is a story of ambition, innovation, and spectacular success. And like so many foundational American stories, it is built on a hidden bedrock of sacrifice. The quarterbacks of the Lost class were pioneers on a frontier of violence. They explored the outer limits of the human body's capacity to endure, and the map they left behind was drawn in their own scars. That map showed the league where the cliffs were, and it wisely built a fence. But the fence was built only after the fall. So as we look at the modern game, the prolific passing stats, the 40-year-old quarterbacks, the clinical efficiency of today's offenses, we should see more than just evolution. We should see a monument. We should see the ghost of Neil Lomax's kidney failure in every roughing the passer flag. We should hear the echo of Ken O'Brien's internal clock shattering in every clean pocket a modern quarterback enjoys. We should remember Joe Theismann's leg not just as a Monday night horror show, but as the canary in the coal mine, the warning that went unheeded for too long. The NFL Darkside is not a place of monsters. It is a place of sobering truths. It is the understanding that the brilliance of the spiral requires the threat of the sack. That the glory of the game is purchased with the currency of pain. That for every legend celebrated in the light, there is a man standing in the shadow, paying the bill on a payment plan that lasts a lifetime. The 1985 season is not an aberration. It is the clearest, most concentrated example of this eternal exchange. The field is empty. The season is long over. But the accounting continues. It continues in every new rule debated, in every concussion protocol reviewed, in every disability claim filed by a broken old warrior. It continues in our own decision to watch, to cheer, and to remember. The legacy of the Lost class is not that they were victims. It is that they were the evidence. Their broken bodies were the data. Their silenced careers were the argument. And the slightly safer, more rational, yet still unforgiving game we watch today is the verdict. They were the price. And the game, for all its beauty and all its terror, was worth it to everyone but them.